Hey, George, Angelo, Roxy.
Morning, Max.
Morning, Max.
So we're working today. That's great.
Okay, so everybody can hear you?
Hi, everybody. Alex, say something for me, would you?
Hey, good morning. Perfect.
What a miracle. Thank
All
you.
right.
We got sound today. Thanks, Ren. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
All right, now I'll figure out how to start the PowerPoint. Well, we'll get started in just a minute, folks. We have sound today, so that's pretty awesome. I'm very happy. The director was good enough to show up and make it all work. It was actually very nice of him. I don't think he had to be here today otherwise. George is here. Thank goodness. George, welcome. All right.
Hello. How are you, Professor?
Excellent. How are you?
Doing wonderful.
I have sound today, so I'm feeling good. We're going to do a PowerPoint today. I'm not promising one every week. Just letting you know we're going to do one.
Awesome.
Maybe. I feel like maybe I should download it. Oh, maybe not. Oh, great. I like that. I love when we're into a problem. Wonderful. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, well, I actually downloading it. And how are you this week?
I'm doing well.
Busy week,
How about yourself?
very busy week. Yeah. Yeah, incredibly busy. Just hectic, at least maybe a better word. But that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Did everyone had a good week out there in class land?
Not bad.
Excellent. Ah, look at that. So slideshow from beginning. I know you can see it. Now I gotta make sure everyone else can. So, yeah. Go to Zoom. Can you all see that? Where it says real estate title and conveyance?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Start in about a minute. In here last week, I'm sure of it.
Hmm.
I see it's a very sensitive microphone. Ah, that's pretty good.
Will this PowerPoint be available in one of the modules?
I have to check something, so I'm gonna give you a strong maybe, but the Zoom's being recorded, so either way, you'll have it that way, but there's I used, as you'll see, a couple pieces of copyrighted material, so I just gotta check on that. And then if I can, I will, and if I'm not supposed to, I won't. I know I'm allowed to use it to present to a class. I'm just not sure if I'm allowed to publish it. But either way, you'll be able to see it on the Zoom. And then really, I mean, I guess it's always helpful, but I don't know how helpful it really is. You know, just to help us follow along and to illustrate a thing or two. Also, I want to remind everyone while we're just getting started that what was before the week 5 class is now the week 4 class and vice versa. So the midterm will be on week 4, as well as the class. I think I changed it in the syllabus in Canvas, but I'm not positive if it took. I changed it. I'm just not sure if it's there. But this one, I'm gonna remind you all every week.
Yep, it shows midterm the 27th.
Yeah, perfect, it'll work. Excellent. And that'll be an all Zoom class. So I guess you're welcome to come Zoom from here. All right, we're gonna get started today. Welcome, everybody. In about 10 minutes, I have to take roll. So, but I see a few people are still logging in. I don't want to shortchange those of you who are already here, so I'll get started, but I'm going to wait a few minutes to take roll. Apparently I'm supposed to, and I don't want to have to go back to the video again to try to do it after the fact. So we'll do that in about 10 minutes. Today, and welcome everybody. I hope you all had a great week. I had kind of a busy week. If I'm a little bit hoarse, it's because all I did was talk all week. I was in court depots, you name it, and my voice is not loving it. So that's why I'm not ill or anything. I'm just hoarse. Okay, well, today we're going to be talking about real estate title and conveyances. I decided to do this with some visual aid, which is our PowerPoint presentation that's on the screen. I think this will be helpful. Basically, we're going to follow along what's in the syllabus and talk about all sorts of stuff relating to title. Some of it in more detail, some of it less detail, but enough to try to give you all a working knowledge of how to do stuff. I want to warn you up front, I'm not trying to go into it from like a law school standpoint, you know, where you got to know abstract stuff that realistically, if you're out in the field, you would just ask your lawyer about. Just want, you know, but it's also important you need to know all the terminology. A lot of material because it's a 4-hour class, but it's not going to be fire hose like it was last week, I hope. Okay, and with that, we're going to get started. I think. There we go. First, we're going to talk about estates and land. Okay, so the first concept we're going to talk about, and you hear it a lot, is called fee simple. Okay, fee simple is really redundant because fee is really the word that matters. But, you know, lawyers like to add words because it's, you know, dollars per word. So you'll hear fee, fee simple, fee absolute. Fee is just kind of a way you talk about land and ownership in land, okay? And like you hear it in different words like defeasance, but mostly you hear it in fee simple, which is in a lot of deeds. And simply put, fee simple is the best. It's the greatest possible estate or interest in land wherein the owner has the right to use it, exclusively possess it, ruin it to an extent, dispose of it by deed or will, and to take its fruits and its vegetables and all of its wealth. A fee simple represents absolute ownership of land, and therefore the owner may do whatever he or she chooses with the land. If an owner of fee simple dies intestate, the land gets inherited or descends to their heirs. And all an heir is, to be clear, is somebody who inherits your stuff by law, okay? As opposed to by you giving it to them on purpose, like VO will. The important thing to really note is that this is a really true fee simple is kind of abstract because no one has absolute rights over land, because when they take their land, there's certain rights that were already excluded from it. A little later, we'll go over in greater detail the rules of land ownership, but probably the most important one is that somebody can only give what they have. So if you have, and you know, we use the example like the Brooklyn Bridge or whatever. So if you own the Brooklyn Bridge, you can give away the Brooklyn Bridge, sell the Brooklyn Bridge. But if you don't, you can't. You can try, but you don't have it. So you can only give what you got. So when you have land, when you own land, even in fee simple or fee simple absolute, which are the same thing, you don't have 100% rights to the land because you have things like, you know, the country, you know, like the United States, the laws, state of Florida, environmental issues, you know, other regulations that affect it. And we'll go over all this today, actually, but you have like, let's say, you know, you own your property in a neighborhood, in a planned unit, community, a development, you have the rules and restrictions that go with that land when you bought it. So fee simple used to mean 800 years ago. Because remember, everything we study in this class, really almost everything we study in this class, all originated about 1,000 years ago. Okay, so we're dealing with really old law that's evolved over time. So yeah, maybe it used to mean maybe subject just to the king, or if the king owned it himself, then it was 100% of the power. But now, you get maybe 90, whatever, but it's still considered fee simple. Okay, and the reason I like to go over fee simple as a starting point is because everything goes downhill from there, right? As far as ownership and land. When it's fee simple, you have the maximum possible estate and land. And that's why those words are very much on purpose. The greatest possible estate, because a true absolute, and that's why I don't usually use the word absolute, tends to imply absolute, but it's really not. It's as good as you're going to get, as good as anyone could get. Okay, now you're going to see this slide, I think twice. I think I left it in here twice because it's important concepts. Property ownership is measured on two axes. It's measured of power and time. Power refers to your power to exercise control over the property. Time refers to how long the power lasts. The strongest form of ownership, like we just spoke about, is fee simple. And that's where you have 100% of the power, let's say really 98%, right? But 100% of the power for infinity, for all time. Okay, and that's important because when you own property in fee simple, you can deed it away, of course, but if you don't, your heirs, your next in line of legal succession, get the property, and then their heirs get the property. So your line, what's known as per stirpes, from your loins, Latin for from your loins, your line keeps the land forever. Okay, and that's very, until they get rid of it, of course. And that's a very important concept. And it looks like this, and hopefully, you can see my mouse out there in Zoom land? Okay, so over here you have your power access, okay, 0 to 100%, and then you have your time access, now to forever, okay? And then all ownership of property is measured along these two axes. So as you can see, fee simple, which is, obviously they're on top of each other. Fee simple is the 100% forever, okay, as represented here, okay? But a lease, and you're like, whoa, a lease is ownership? And yes, as we spoke about last week, when you're a tenant, you have an ownership interest in the property. However, your ownership interest is limited, okay? You see? Because you don't have all of this power. So you have the power of possession, you get to live there. Maybe you have the power to hang a picture, but not the power to paint the walls. And you also have the power only for a certain amount of time. And that is just when your lease ends. Okay, also your power can be terminated by someone with greater power. But what's important, now remember, we just said rule number 1 of property ownership is you can only transfer or convey what you have, which means that if you have a 1-year lease and it doesn't say anything about assigning your lease, you can only assign a 1-year lease or what's remaining of your lease. So, you have this lease ownership interest. So if you're a tenant in your property and your lease is silent as to whether or not you can assign the lease, in other words, sell the lease to somebody else, you can't, just by default. So most leases will contain a clause, you can't assign it without landlord approval. But because a lease is an ownership interest, it used to be known as, a long time ago, though it's a little different, an estate for years, okay? It's a property interest just like anything else. You can also will your lease. You can put your lease in your will. If you die, your lease will descend to your heirs just like any other ownership interest. Of course, unless the agreement is to the contrary, which you'll often see like in personal leases. You'll see things like, this lease shall terminate or whatever. It doesn't have the right to go to heirs without, blah, blah, blah. But just by default, yeah, if you pass away and you have a 1-year lease, a 30-year lease, your heirs will inherit your property ownership interest, your lease in that property. And that's why, in a nutshell, why you can't just take back your own property. So let's say you're a landlord and your tenant's being a punk. So you want to take back your property. You can't just go change the locks. You know why? Well, we just told you why. The reason is because they own the property, at least that amount of power for that amount of time. Can you all see me too, or just the screen? I'm just curious.
I can see you as well.
Okay, yeah, good. So I'll keep doing the hand gestures. Okay, see that amount of power for that amount of time, okay? Or vice versa. So that's an important kind of mind-blowing concept, because I know I didn't think, and I don't think many people think of being a tenant as being an owner of that property for certain power and time. But when you think about it that way, everything else makes more sense. So many people have heard of something called a life estate. Okay, a life estate is simply an ownership interest in the property for as long as you live. And then it goes to the next designated person. So this would look like on a deed from Gary to Gary for life, and then to Max, which means that as soon as I die, it goes to Max by operational law without anything else happening. Okay, and I want you to understand that on the chart, that means that I basically have 100% of power, a little bit less, and I'll explain that later, but I can't ruin the property for Max because he's getting it next. So that diminishes my power a little bit. That's called waste. But I only have it for my lifetime. After my lifetime, I don't get to have it anymore. Max has it. But that also means that even though Max can't come use the property now, he can't rent it, he can't do anything because right now it's mine because my heart's still beating. Max does have an ownership interest in the property. It's just not possessory yet. It's a future interest. And we'll spend a little bit of time on that later. Okay. Now, a life estate, being an ownership interest in the property, goes by all the same rules. I can convey it. I can give it away. I can sell it and transfer it. Right. But all I can sell or transfer is what I have. So, for example, let's say that I was going to deed my life estate to Kip. Kip would have a life estate for my life, not his. So when I die, he would be dispossessed and Max would get the property. That's called a life estate pour atra vie, which just means for the life of another. So again, as you can see, I can only deed what I have. Now what happens, and let's put this one out to the group, what would happen, let's say I transferred my life estate to, I'll just make up a name, XYZ. I don't want to do this to anyone. And then XYZ died before me. What would happen to the interest? Anyone? I can't see everybody, so.
On to the next person.
Who's the next person?
There is no
That's
next person.
Yeah, I mean, do you have a backup? Or?
Well, that's a good answer. It's a good try. But here's,
XYZ's heirs?
I say who said that? Say that again.
I said XYZ's heirs?
Excellent. Yes, correct. Who said that?
I did.
Nicholas? Is that you?
Yes.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Yes, XYZ's heirs. Now here's an important concept. Everybody has heirs. Everybody has heirs. Because, if you pass away, it's going to somebody. It may be your fifth cousin on your uncle's side or whatever, or it may even be in effect the government if there really is nobody, but everyone has heirs. So it wouldn't go back to me because I transferred the interest for my entire life. Okay, now of course I could make it so it did go back to me if I did something different. We'll talk about that later. But in this scenario, it goes to the heirs of the life tenant. Okay, so when you can literally go and buy a life estate. And people do, believe it or not, it's not as uncommon as you might think. But the floor of all this, the 100% forever fee simple is the best, obviously, because you have the full power. Now, of all these things, there's countless variations. So I said a little earlier, okay, that in a life estate, and I was giving it to Max, Max had certain vested rights in the property. He is getting the property when I die. I will die. Okay, we all will die, at least as for current technology. Maybe soon there'll be jars where you put my head in it like The Simpsons, and I can live forever. And the law will have to grow to deal with that. But as of now, everyone dies. So there's no question that Max will get my property. Now, again, if Max passes away before I do, God forbid, his heirs will get the property because he has an ownership interest in the land. It's just a future interest. Okay, so that's kind of a very important concept. See, yeah. Gabram, let's see.
You can call me Gabby.
Gabby, sorry about that. I'm gonna see if I can put these out, the slides out there, but either way, the whole Zoom is being recorded. So you'll have the opportunity to see there and
Oh, so it'll be shared somewhere else as well?
the whole Zoom will be on your campus in a day or so. As is last week's. Alec, you had a question?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So a friend of mine who's a developer, he purchased the house of a very famous American actor. He was a little bit older. So the way they structured the sale was that actor would get to live in that house until he dies, however long that lasted. And he would pay like $1 a month or something like that. Does that pertain to what we're talking about?
Well, it does not. I mean, it does in that we're talking about all ownership interests, but it's not a life estate. A life estate owner, what we call a life tenant, owns the property. They're not a tenant. What you described seems to be that they bought the property and then they leased it back to the prior owner under a long-term lease for $1 a year, which is a whole different thing. But as you can see, the seller still has an ownership interest. They have a lease interest, but that is less rights, less power than a life tenant. A life tenant has an incredible amount of rights in the property. They're not limited like a tenant is. And I know a lot of these words are like repeated, like life tenant versus, like a landlord tenant thing, but that's because it all comes from 1,000-year-old stuff and it's being, morphed for today. So a life tenant literally is the owner of the property. They can do renovations. They don't have to ask anyone's permission. They own it. They just own it until they die. The only thing they really can't do is destroy the property. Okay, they do have some responsibility to maintain the property at some level to protect the what we call the remaindermen. And we'll go over remainder later. The remaindermen are the next person's interest. In my example, I would be the life tenant, Max would be the remainderman. Okay, and even if it's a remainder woman, it's still a remainderman. That's just a legal term. You follow?
Does a life tenant have to be a renter?
No, a life tenant is never a renter. Life tenant's an owner. Nor does a life tenant have to live in the property. You can have a life tenant in a mine, like a coal mine, where you own it for life and then it goes to the next in line. So one of the ways that life tenancies or, life estates are used is for estate planning purposes. So for example, let's say, a real scenario, my mom, we put her property in a life estate, in a special kind of life estate I'm going to talk about in a minute called the Ladybird. And when she passed, by operation of law, without having to go through probate, no wills, none of that other stuff, I automatically became the owner of the property. Okay, just because I was the remainderman, she was the life tenant. Now, while she was alive, she didn't have to ask me if she can hang a picture. She could have, done whatever she wanted to the property. She could have moved out from the property. She could have rented the property. It's hers for all intents and purposes. All she couldn't do was destroy it. In other words, she had to pay the property taxes as a life tenant. She had to not burn it to the ground on purpose as a life tenant, etc. But it's hers 100%. Don't let the tenant part fool you. A life tenant is an owner. They're a tenant in the sense of tenancy, like tenancy by the entirety, joint tenants, which we'll talk about. They're not a tenant like landlord tenants. And as a matter of fact, for the most part, I'm going to try my very best to use the word renter when we're talking about leases for the rest of this class. Okay, I might mess up, but because I'm not used to doing that, but just to make it less confusing. Okay, so a tenant can be an owner, a tenant can be a renter. It's one word used for multiple ways. And the reason it is because like we said before, even a renter has an ownership interest. It's just limited in power, limited in time. But don't fool yourself. It's an ownership interest. And as I started a little while ago and got a little sidetracked, that's why you have to evict a renter. You can't just toss them because they have an ownership interest. So you have to go to court, terminate their ownership interest, and then have them dispossessed of their land, you know, if it ends before the natural end of it. So that's why you have to go to court to evict. You can't self-help or do it yourself because they're owners of those rights you transfer. So in effect, the lease in a lot of ways is like a deed, right? If you think about it, it's just a lot more complicated than a deed because, you know, it goes, you know, into a lot of detail about, you know, paying rent and what you can and can't do. Just so you all know, yeah, Max, I'm going to get to you 1 second. Thank you. Just so you know, I can't see everyone at the same time because I'm sharing the screen. So if for some reason, like you want to ask a question and I don't call on you for a little bit, just pipe up. You know, I hate to say that, just pipe up because it means I didn't see. But I did see Max, so go ahead.
If you have a property in a life estate and you can't intentionally burn it down, what happens if someone does burn it down or destroy it in a crime or something? Does
Absolutely, that's a great question. This
you
goes
get the
into
money? Do you get the value? Do you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Gotcha, I got you, Max. This goes into a concept called waste. And the concept of waste we'll use in different ways. And I'll go over in the other ways later. But in this way, what it means is that you're wasting the value of the property. You're allowing it to become damaged and you're negatively affecting other owners. Okay, and when that happens, that person, the remainderman in this case, the person who's getting it next, sues you. And they can get compensated. They can enjoin you, in other words, have the court force you to stop doing it. They can get monetarily compensated. And in extreme cases, the court can even dispossess the life tenant. But that's a very extreme remedy. Typically, what will happen is that the life tenant would be ordered to take care of the property or to reimburse the remainderman. Now, sometimes this happens because the life tenant doesn't have the ability to care for the property anymore. In which case, the remainderman can step up and do it themselves. So let's say that my mom, in my scenario, couldn't pay her taxes. You know, she just couldn't afford to do it because she had a mean kid and Social Security wasn't enough, right? So I could have stepped in as the remainderman, as the person next in line with a vested ownership later interest and paid the taxes. And then in effect had a lien on the property on her interest for the taxes, including maybe her estate, let's say, if that was the case. I can get a judgment against her to be reimbursed for the taxes. So the remaindermen in this case have rights if the life tenant, the current owner, is wasting the property's potential. Okay, and again, it's lots of fancy legal words, life tenant, remainderman, but it just means if the person who already owns it later is getting the property messed up by the person who owns it now, they can take legal action to be compensated for that. And, you know, frankly, when you think about this, you know, you got life tenant, remainderman, but really just is the person who already owns it now and the person who already owns it in the future, right? So, you know, future interests count. Very good question. We have any other questions on life estate before I jump into Ladybird? Okay, great. So a Ladybird deed, which was actually invented right here in Broward County about 40 years ago now by an attorney in Broward County, which is kind of a cool little bit of trivia, not me, before my time, is a special type of life estate deed. And I said earlier that leases, deeds, you can get as creative really as you want, as long as you're not breaking the law, in how you transfer property. So for example, and we'll talk about this a little later, I can deed my property to my brother as long as he doesn't marry that you-know-what, in which case I get it back. And that would be perfectly valid. And it's a real case where that happens. So, you know, you can get very creative with this. You can deed it, from me to Kip for a year, and then to Max for a year, and then to Nick for a year, et cetera, and then back to me. I can do all that. You can get very creative. Okay, really, it's as long as you're not, being discriminatory or doing something illegal, people get very creative. So a ladybird deed, which some people talk about as an enhanced life estate, is a special type of deed that creates a special type of life estate. And the very simple background, the reason it's called a ladybird deed is when the attorney who invented it, and literally invented this special language in this deed, which is widely accepted now all over the country, he used President Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson, his wife, as the example in the article he wrote up about. So, he said, oh, President Johnson had this, Lady Bird, I think it was Johnson, or Johnson, did it. So that's why it's been known ever since as Lady Bird, because that first lady was known as Lady Bird. Why? I don't know. Okay, but in this half life estate, basically what it says, and I'm going to back up a little bit into that example I said before. So I said, when I have a life estate and then to Max has a vested remainder. Okay, meaning he's definitely going to get it next. In a ladybird deed, I say from me to Max, definitely, unless I change my mind, using special words to accomplish that. And what that means is that if I take no further action, then Max will get the property by law without doing anything at the moment of my death. However, if before that I deed it to somebody else, Max doesn't have any say in the matter. Okay, so why is that important? Because under a standard life estate, since in this case the remainder of Max has that vested next interest, I can't sell more than I have, meaning I can only sell for my life. If I want to sell the whole fee simple, I got to get Max to sign off on it because he has to sell his future interest too. With a ladybird deed, I don't need his sign off. And okay, now here's another interesting fact, right? Life estate deed from me to Max, I want to go get a 30-year mortgage. Okay, if Max doesn't sign off on that mortgage on a regular life estate, then guess what? At the moment of my death, maybe it's next year, that mortgage is invalid. It's not valid against the property because Max owns it now and he didn't consent to the mortgage. So no lender is going to give a mortgage to a life tenant unless the remainderman signs off on it. Right? So this is often used, frankly, one of the ways life estates are used. They're used in business a lot, like investment deals. But one of the way they're used, if you have an elderly parent and they want to own their own property, you don't want to have to go through probate when you die, and you don't want them to get suckered by a telemarketer, selling a mortgage at high interest rate or whatever. You put it in a life estate and they can't properly mortgage the property without the kids signing off on it. However, in some cases, mom or dad may not like that idea. So like in my case, my mom had a ladybird deed. So she could have divested me anytime she wanted. In other words, got rid of my interest, mortgaged the property without my permission. But since she did nothing, I just got the property that she passed. But she could have. And that's the difference in a ladybird. I call it a life estate with backseats. I just think that's a good way to remember it. Okay? Any questions by backseats? I remember when you were kids, I got a question from in the house. Yes.
Hello, everyone. So I recently represented the seller for a few properties where she was the life
Let
estate.
me just hold you 1 second. Can everyone hear her? Can you speak up a little?
Okay, can you hear me now? Is that better? Hopefully. Okay, so I recently represented the seller for a few properties where she was the life estate and she had her son on the deed with her. I'm not sure if it was Ladybird or the regular life estate, but he never had to sign the document. Her attorney said she's the only one that has to sign.
It was a ladybird.
Okay, I never fully understood.
Yep,
This
and
makes
that's
sense
why.
to me.
So she had a situation as a realtor where her seller had a life estate, but the son didn't have to sign off. And the answer is that's because it's a ladybird. Just so you know, a ladybird is also known as an enhanced life estate. Okay, just to be clear. Okay, you may see some people use ladybird, some people use life estate. I think it's really a matter of whether or not you like Jerome. That's the attorney who wrote it. Okay, any other questions on life estate, enhanced life estate, and or the power and time matrix?
What was the life estate for Atrapur? Or what's?
Oh, the life estate for Atra V, and my French is probably terrible, just means for the life of another. So if you don't want to use the French, just say life estate for the life of another. And that means when you have a life tenant who deeds their interest, their life interest, it's measured by the person who originally got the life estate's life, not the new owner's life. Which makes sense if you remember, you can never transfer more than you have. Which seems obvious, and I guess is, but you know, lawyers like to write stuff down. Okay, great. That's if you get this power of time thing, you're halfway there. Truly. Okay, so now that we got out of the frying pan, we're going to jump right into the fire. Once you understand power over time, the next power and time, the next key concept is joint tenancies. Okay, that's when you own property, multiple parties own property jointly. Okay, and we're going to start off with tenants in common. Okay, there's only 3 of these, and you do need to know specifically what they are and what the differences are. This is very important. This comes up constantly in real estate development and the law. Okay, constantly. Okay, like literally in almost every deal. So the first type is tenants in common. This is the fallback. This is the floor, the default, whatever you want to call it. Unless one of the other types comes into play, this is what it is. Okay, tenants in common, often seen as TIC in the real world. This is the standard form of ownership. All parties have a divisible share of the whole. Can be equal or different if it's specified. So if Gary and Jeff, my brother, own a property, and that's what it says, okay? So from mom to Gary and Jeff, we each own 50-50 of the property. If it's from mom to Gary for 90%, because I'm the favorite, and Jeff for 10%, then I own 90%, he owns 10%. Okay, if it's from mom to Gary and Jeff and Danny and Elena, then we each own a fifth. Okay, seems very simple, and actually it is very simple. Each person has a slice of the pie, equal unless it's specified different. Okay, now I'm going to stop for just a second and say any questions, because if you don't fully get this, you're never going to get the other ones. Okay, good, excellent. The next form of joint ownership is what we call joint tenants with rights of survivorship. And in this form of ownership, each joint owner owns 100%. So if it's Alec and Kip and Max, they each are 100% co-owners of the property, which you would think would equal 300%, but since lawyers are not accountants, it's only 100%. Okay, it's a legal fiction. Why is this important, would you say? Anyone want to take a guess why this distinction is very important?
A decision can't be made with all parties agreeing upon together.
That's a very good guess. It's not correct, but it's a good guess. It is a good guess, but it's not correct. Anyone else?
Because you can bit of an echo. I'm sorry. You can sell off. Each individual has 100% rights to do whatever they want with the property.
Well, you know, that's also a good guess along with Max's, and I'm glad I'm getting these guesses, because in this guess, I want to tell you that everyone always has the right to, it's called alienate, to sell off their property, to alienate their property unless they agree otherwise. So under any form of ownership, you have a right to alienate. As a matter of fact, we have constitutional rights to alienate our properties. It's in the Constitution. So everyone always has the rights to sell their property unless they agreed otherwise. But it is a good guess. Anyone else want to take a chance?
Professor,
Yes,
this makes me think of like unfortunately, when someone passes away, like an estate or like inheritance between siblings, that's what it makes me think of. Like that's the first thing that comes to mind.
and that's actually one of the ways it's very often used.
Okay,
So that's a good instinct.
okay.
Okay, so I won't belabor it anymore. The reason it's important that A owns 100%, B owns 100%, C owns 100% if they're joint tenants with right of survivorship, because if A goes away, B and C still own 100%. And if C goes away, guess what? B still owns 100%. What's that mean? It means that A and C's heirs don't get squat. Don't get squat. They don't get anything. Okay, because there's no, once they pass away, there's no interest to be inherited. Like I said, it's a legal fiction. So because every party owns 100%, if one of the parties disappears, then the other parties still own 100%. And the party's heirs don't have anything they can get because it has survivorship features. The survivors keep owning the same way, and the decedent, the person who passed away, just goes away. They blink out of existence as far as the property is concerned by operation of law. You don't need to go to court. You don't need to go to probate. It just happens. So the other joint owners, so again, it's me and my brother as joint tenants with right of survivorship, and I pass away, my kids and wife don't get anything. He continues to be 100% owner. Then when he passes away, his kids and heirs or whatever get the property, not mine. Okay, because he is the only owner after it. So that's a kind of a very important concept. Now, if one of those,
Quick question.
yes.
So basically, the last person who passes away, their heirs inherit?
Their heirs or devises, yes. And devise just means if like they have a will saying it's not their heirs, it gets it to someone else. They have full power. In other words, when you're the last person, you don't own it joint tenants with right of survivorship anymore because you don't own it with anyone else. You just own it alone, fee simple. Or whatever, however you own it. You can have 3 life tenants, joint tenants with right of survivorship. So it can get pretty wacky, which means it's a life tenant based on the last of those. It's a life tenancy based on the last of those 3 to die. You follow? So that's kind of, I know, like a hard concept, then that won't be on the test, I don't think. Well, you know what? Maybe it will, actually, because it's not that hard of a concept now that I think about it. Anything you can own jointly, and you can own in these methods. And you know what? Actually, I fully retract that. This probably will be on the test in one form or another, because these ownerships are not just in real estate. If you have a bank account with someone else, it's going to be in one of these 3 forms. It's all property. Business property, personal property, bank accounts. There's a lot of people who have bank accounts, joint tenants with right of survivorship. Okay, which means that they're joint tenants, but if one of the persons passes away, the other person maintains the full account. Because if you owned a bank account, tenants in common, then that first person's heirs would get half of the bank account, not the joint owner. So typically when you have a joint bank account, it is with survivorship. And this becomes even more important when we talk about the next form, but we're not quite done with this one. So to be clear, this is full ownership, but it's full ownership where everyone owns 100%, meaning that if one person blinks out of existence, the other people or person still owns 100%. So yes, in effect, the last to die wins, or their heirs do, but it doesn't have to be that way. However, okay, and kind of taking it to the next step, there's nothing contractual about joint tenants with rights of survivorship. So if Alec, Max, and Gabby own a property together, joint tenants with right of survivorship, and Max decides to deed his share to Cho, anyone want to take a guess of what happens? There's 2 things that happen. Anyone?
Max
Okay.
might Just leave.
Say again?
Max might as well just walk away because Cho now has his 100%.
Well, Cho doesn't have, Max is walking away because he deeded away his part, but Cho doesn't have his 100%. Cho has his third. As do Gabby have a third now and Alec has a third now. Because the reason we went over tenants in common first and said it's the floor, because a joint tenants right of survivorship is a beautiful glass figurine. And if something breaks it, it falls to the floor and ends up as a tenants in common. So if you're in a joint tenants right of survivorship and one of the parties deeds away their part to a third party, everyone loses a survivorship feature. And the new owner becomes has an equal share with the old owner.
So
But
one,
now they're all tenants in common. So it's not hard to break a joint tenants right of survivorship. All you have to do is have one of the joint tenants convey their share to a third party.
so
You know,
one,
I'm gonna give it a
And then
second
it's-
to suck in.
And it's automatically broken?
It's automatically broken, correct. Not only is it automatically broken, you have to take very affirmative actions to reestablish. It's
Do
not
the-
like it might be broken, it's broken. And everyone now owns tenants in common, which is they all have divisible share. And this comes up. I mean, I actually have a current case based on this very issue. So this does come up. Yes,
If the joint tenants are transferring something to another party and you say that tenants in common comes in place, isn't tenants in common mean, so it's equally divided within them? So let's say if it's 4 people and then let's say it's A, B, and C, and then, or D, and then the D transfers it to somebody else, it's gonna be divided equally within those new 4 people?
yes. Well, no, because you can only, okay, so this is great, actually. What fun. Okay, so first of all 3 of the types that we're talking about right now are all joint tenants. We're only talking about when people own property together. So you have tenants in common, which is really joint tenants in common, joint tenants right of survivorship, and then we'll talk about the other one. I don't want to confuse you yet. The other one in a minute, okay? But they're all joint tenants, no matter what. If you own property with someone else, you're joint owners or joint tenants, first of all. Second of all, let's say there's 3 people and one person, so you got A, B, and C, and then C deeds to D, right? So now you have A owns a third, B owns a third, D owns a third as tenants in common, right? Now, if D deeds it to 2 other people, you have A owns a third, B owns a third, E owns a sixth, F owns a sixth, because you can only transfer what you have, right? So what you'll see sometimes is that you'll have A and B will deed their half to B and little b, you know, like their kid. Since you're introducing a third party, right, it breaks the survivorship feature. Now A owns 50%, and in this case, B owns either 25% and little b owns 25%, or maybe they deeded it to B and little b as joint tenants right of survivorship, in which case they both have an undivided 100% of the 50%. Because remember rule number 1, and it really is rule number 1 of property, you can only transfer what you have, no more. You can transfer less, but you can't transfer more. Okay, but also understand that in every case, if you break a right of survivorship, you fall back to the floor, which is tenants in common. And since it's not specified as unequal shares, it's going to be equal shares. Okay, so and because it's not specified, you can't have joint tenants right of survivorship 80% to A, 20% to B. That's not possible because they both own 100%. So there's no, you can't like predefine the fallback, if that makes sense. Now you can, but you need to do a trust, you know, something much more complicated. You can accomplish the same way, but not in a simple joint tenancy. Okay. Now, what you can't do, let's say you have a deed. Now, there's a reason for this, and now that I didn't really include it here because it's a little beyond the scope, and this will not be on the test. But there's certain conditions that must be met to establish a joint tenant with right of survivorship and the one we're going to go next. Okay, and if they're not, if all of them are not met, it's not established and it stays a tenants in common. And one of those conditions is that all of the joint tenants to establish a right of survivorship must take it on the same time and in the same deed. So as soon as you deed part away, it's not the same deed anymore and it breaks. So it's not just, you know, loosey-goosey, there's actually like tests to see if something broke. So if you have A, B, and C, and B deeds it to B, just to break the joint tenancy, that doesn't work. Because there's no real transfer. It's just a piece of paper. There's nothing actually being transferred. And that's because of those tests. It has to be the same interest, the same time, the same deed. They're called unities of title in case you care, but it's not going to be in the test. If all of the unities, the required 5 unities are not in place, that you don't have a joint tenants right of survivorship. If one of the unities gets broken, okay, then the survivorship breaks. And in this case, what you're doing is you're breaking the time and interest because they don't all have the same interest at the same time. And this actually becomes a little more important with the next one. But that part's not on the test. I just want you to understand it's not like loosey-goosey or I forget the word, but it's not like just do whatever you want. There's actually like rules to this, and they're called the unities. And believe it or not, they come up in court cases. Okay, any other questions on joint tenants at right of survivorship? Because you have to understand it, because the next one, we're just going to enhance it. Go ahead, Max.
In no way can B and C have a say if A wants to deed it away?
No, not in a joint tenants at right of survivorship situation. They cannot. They do not have that power. Now, again, if that's what the parties are trying to accomplish, there's other ways to do it. It's just not this way. And this is why you see a lot of people own properties in revocable trusts or trusts, because you can do all those things in trusts, and we'll go over that later today. But you can't do it just in a basic joint tenants right of survivorship. The other piece that you need to know is how it looks on a deed. I don't have a slide for this, but it's simple. Okay, I'm going to start you off with 2 terms. Okay, and these terms are important: grantor and grantee. Okay, and the whole grantor, grantee, or the or e thing, you see a lot, right? Tort fees or, tort fee C, grantor, grantee. You know, in effect, you know, you don't have buyor and buyee, but you probably should. Owner and ownee, you know, which actually is a legal word. Okay, very simple way I remembered it. Maybe it'll help you. Or gives to E. So the or is the party that has it. The E is the party that gets it. That's how I always remembered it in law school. Anytime you see something in the law ending in or, and there's the same word ending in E, or gives to E. Okay, so a property owner who takes a mortgage is the mortgagor because, or has a mortgage, because in reality, what they're doing is they're giving the mortgage to the bank, the mortgagee. The bank receives the mortgage and gives the money. So they're the transferor of the money to the borrower, the transferee. So or always gives to E. Okay, so a grantor is the seller, the grantee is the buyer. The grantor is the grantor might be the donor, which is someone who's giving away a gift. The donee is the person receiving the gift. That's where you have donor and donee. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so everyone got those terms, grantor, grantee? Okay, so on a deed, you will know some tenants in common if it says from grantor to grantee A and grantee B. And no other words. Boom, tenants in common. Okay? If it's to be a joint tenants at right of survivorship, the deed would read grantor to grantee A and grantee B as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Specifically says the words. Okay, you may also see it as as joint tenants with right of survivorship and not as tenants in common. The reason being 50 years ago, you had to use the last part. You don't anymore, but a lot of people still do. Okay, it is very specific. You have to include those words. There's actually a statute on the books that says you must use those words. Okay, so everyone got that? The only way you can create a joint tenant with rights of survivorship is by using the magic words in the deed. Now, if you use the magic words, it doesn't mean it actually happens, because if you mess something else up, you know, if you do from grantor to grantee A, 80% and grantee B, 20% as joint tenants right of survivorship, doesn't work. They're both tenants in common. But without those words, there's no way possible for it to work.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes, I hope someone would, because that's complicated. Go ahead.
My question is regarding issues with any legalities, how it would play out in these different scenarios of ownership. So let's say like for survivorship, everyone has 100%. So if there's a legal issue that arises, it would be equally responsible for all ownership as opposed to the tenants in common? Or how would that play out exactly?
You mean like to pay the lawyer?
No,
Or
just
just as far as like liability, like if someone tripped and fell?
yeah, or lien, or
Sure. Yes, the answer to your question is yes. So, frankly, either way. So if it's joint tenants or right of survivorship, because they all own 100%, they're all 100% responsible, equally responsible. Okay. If it's 50, well, you know, okay, you know what? That's a good question, because there's a little twist on it, right? So let's say it's A and B tenants in common, and someone gets $100,000 judgment on against them. A is really only going to owe $150,000, and B is going to owe $100,000. I mean $50,000 to add up to one. Let me do that again. Let's say it's 10, because I messed it up. Let's say it's tenants in common. A and B own it. They each own. So sorry. Just give me 1 second. I apologize. My wife called me and she knows I'm in class, so I'm just texting her, see if it was an emergency or if she forgot. Okay, anyway, so A and B each own 50%. So let's say there's $100,000 in liability. They each own half of it, 50 grand each. Okay, and that's all the person who, let's say, gets the judgment, the person who got injured, can get from each of them. In reality, they can take the property, but putting that to the side. Let's say it's a bank account. That's tenants in common. Okay, it's 50-50, literally. And this actually comes into play with like credit card judgments. So, you know, let's say that someone owes money on a credit card. Actually, can you guys just give me 1 second? I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Not an emergency, it was my 12-year-old. Who now will probably not have the best afternoon. Sorry about that. All right, so you get that. So it's 50-50, it's a bank account, and they get a judgment. Really, let's say there's 100 grand in there. In a perfect world, the creditor is only going to be able to get to half of the bank account, because the other half belongs to the other tenants in common. But if it's joint tenants with right of survivorship, in a perfect world, since they both own 100%, then the creditor can get at the whole thing. In reality, though, it doesn't work that way, because there's a statute that changes that, because that's kind of unfair. But in a perfect legal world, that's how it would work. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did. I just really wanted to understand.
Yeah, no, so and it's true. So, when it comes to like real estate, because you own 50-50, you're both kind of wholly responsible. And what would happen in real life in either case, let's say that like you own it with your sibling and your sibling's not helping pay the bills. Okay, you still have to pay them because you're a property owner, but really under different theories of law, in either case, you could then sue your sibling to get their half back. Okay, in joint tenants, it's under a theory of waste, like we spoke about before. In tenants in common, it's just under a straight liability. Okay, so it's the same effect because lawyers are creative, but there is truly a difference to it legally. Now, I also want to point out that joint tenants with rights of survivorship is a legal fiction. It's made up. Obviously, multiple people can't own 100% of something each because it adds up to more than 100%. Okay, it's just in order to effectuate the results, like someone dies, the other people get it by operational law, a legal fiction is created. Okay, so for example, the bankruptcy court doesn't really recognize the 100%. They're like 50-50, we're going to take half of it. Too bad. Whereas state courts are much more likely to recognize it. Okay, because it's a legal fiction. But when it comes to real estate, which is what this class is, what it means is that if one of the joint tenants die, the other joint tenants remain owners with the same interest they had before, and the person who passed away heirs get nothing. Okay? Got it? Everyone got that? Any other questions? And it's important, actually. Go ahead, because the next one just builds on this.
Does A, B, and C have to be inherent in relation to each other?
Say that one more time.
Does A, B, and C have to be related?
No, as a matter of fact, they don't. They do not. They just have to be actual people. So you really can't have joint tenants right of survivorship if one of them is a corporation. Unlike tenants in common, you can use corporations on tenants in common. Company A and company B on the property together, which is actually very common. They just can't own a joint tenants right of survivorship. It's only for people. But they don't even have to know each other.
They don't have to know each other.
No, if I gave the property to 3 strangers, joint tenants right of survivorship, that's how they would, as long as they said okay, because you have to accept an ownership transfer, they would each own it, even if they don't know each other.
Do they have to be aware of the other people or just not know them?
Yes, they have to know the deed and accept it. Part of deeding a property is accepting the deed that the grantee accepts. Not like they have to say, I accept, just by action.
What if you did it to a child can't accept just for a
Then it's not a valid. Okay, so the question was, what if you deed it to a minor who can't accept because they're under 18, bearing the exceptions for minor ownership, it's where they're going to live, and not using that in this example, since there's always exceptions. No, it's not. It's just not a valid deed because you're transferring to someone that doesn't have a legal existence. So if I transfer, Blackacre to ABC Corp, and there is no such thing, it's just the deed did nothing. Spun around in the air and looked good. Okay, so that's why, and also, if you deed it, let's say the joint tenants right of survivorship, theoretically, in a perfect world, if you deed it to joint tenants right of survivorship to A, B, and C is not in existence. They passed away last week and the person didn't know. What would happen is A and B, the 2 remaining people who are still alive, would take it as tenants in common. Because it's an imperfect transfer. So you almost got to think of like the joint tenants right of survivorship, very powerful tool, but very fragile. Lots of things can break it and lots of things can stop it from forming properly. But when formed properly by using those magic statutory words, it's very useful because it completely avoids probate and completely gets around heirs. So, if you don't want your heirs to get it, or one of your heirs, and you don't want to go through probate, you can use joint tenants right of survivorship. And a lot of people do. Okay. Now, it is important to understand that because joint tenants rights of survivorship are what they call an abrogation of common law, which is just a mouthful, it's word salad. okay, that it has to be set up properly. What that means is because it creates a legal fiction and it's created and authorized by a statute, which is the opposite of common law. You have common law, which is the way things have already been done in cases. And then you have statutory and regulatory law that are passed by legislatures. Because it's a legislator, it has to be set up perfectly, or at least close enough. Okay, you can't form a joint tenant right of survivorship by accident. However, you most certainly and constantly have tenants in commons formed by accident. Okay, and by accident, I mean, like, you know, it wasn't really the intent, but it just worked out that way. You know, mom passes away, it goes to 3 kids, they're tenants in common. There was no like, oh, let's do it tenants in common, this is how we have to do it. It just is tenants in common because that's the way it is. You can't, that doesn't work with a joint tenant right of survivorship. That has to be done very much on purpose. Does that make sense? Okay, I know that one's heavy. The next one's heavier. It's called tenants by the entirety. Okay, under this form of ownership, a marriage owns the property. The marriage, or what's called the entirety, is distinct legally, another legal fiction, from the husband and wife, and therefore is protected from either of them actions individually. So this is like basically a joint tenants right of survivorship that can only exist between spouses, a husband and wife, a husband and husband, a wife and wife, whatever, legally recognized spouses. And it's very clear on this, you know, so before, you know, Florida, let's say, passed same-sex marriages into law, same-sex married couples, even who were married legally in other states, did not and could not own property in Florida as tenants by the entirety because they were not legally married. And we use lots of other tools to accomplish that. There's other, like joint tenants right of survivorship. There's lots of ways to accomplish that. But now that it is legal in Florida, they would each, the marriage, the entirety would own the property. Okay, so this is a very special form of joint tenants right of survivorship that's only available to married parties that take the property on the same deed while they're married. Okay, and again, it's another little crystal creature. So if they get divorced, it falls back to tenants in common. If they bought the property when they were both single and then got married, it doesn't automatically turn into tenants by the entireties. Okay, it has to be set up to be tenants by the entireties, and the marriage has to be intact. Now, the main advantage of this is because the marriage owns the property. Okay, whether it's a bank account, a refrigerator, or a house, creditors of either spouse, but not both, can't touch it, period. Plus, it has the survivorship feature, meaning if one of the spouses passes away, the other spouse maintains it. Obviously, this can only be 2 people and it can't be companies because companies can't get married and more than 2 people cannot under the current law. Okay, very, very important concept. This is the safest way to own property, you know, of the basic ways. Obviously, you know, offshore trusts and stuff. Because, you know, let's say, you know, spouse A and spouse B owns it. Spouse A gets you know, blows their credit card and gets a $50,000 debt. Creditor can't touch the property, even if it's not homestead, even if it's a bank account. Okay. Very important concept. Okay, and obviously, like with bank accounts and stuff, there's a lot of cases out there, a lot of exceptions, but you get the idea. Okay, so and if they get divorced, annulled, whatever, it falls back into tenants in common. Okay, but very important. So, and how this is formed is in a deed. It's from grantor to spouse A and spouse B, their spouse, as spouse and spouse, as tenants by the entirety. Any way to show that it's being transferred under that deed to a married couple. There's no magic words. There just has to be words to create magic. So, for example, if it was from, you know, Joan to Gary and Norma, his wife, tenants by the entirety. Gary and Norma, husband and wife, tenants by the entirety. Gary and Norma as tenants by the entirety, tenants by the entirety. Norma and Gary, her husband, tenants by the entirety. Yes.
That answered my question.
Oh,
but
okay.
I was wondering, when people are purchasing property, do they need to specify?
They need to specify that it's going to, now, if it was just to Gary and Norma, it wouldn't be tenants by the entirety, it would be tenants in common, because they didn't specify it was to the married couple or to the marriage. Everyone got that? Okay, that is great. Let's see where we're at. Okay, you know what? I think this is a good time for me to take roll. So bear with me a second. This is where I need to be. And this is where I need to be. Okay, I'm gonna call your names. And just say present or whatever, okay? Matthew Adams.
Here.
All right, Dominic.
Here.
Okay.
Here.
Nicholas,
Here.
Angelo,
Here.
James,
Here.
Curtis.
Here.
Charlisa. Charlisa now, okay. Okay, Araxi,
Here.
Alexandra, Gray, sorry, Alex. Alexander, Gray, Hebert, you're here? Okay, there you are. Okay, sorry. I stepped on your name. My son's name's Alexander, so that one's
No,
gonna trip me up a lot.
I have a hard time pronouncing it myself.
Sorry about that. Byron Higueros. Okay, Annabelle, I'm so sorry. Annabelle June, are you here? Arindira,
Here.
Mudasar,
Here.
but I saw you. Alec, I saw. Cho, I saw. Crystal,
Here.
excellent. Natalie, you're there. Anna, Reina,
Here.
Anne Marie,
Here.
Gabby. I saw Gabby, didn't I?
Yeah, I said I'm
Yeah, I
here.
thought I saw you. Brandy,
I'm here.
Juliet,
I'm here.
Leland,
I'm here.
Desiree,
Here.
George,
Here.
Dominique,
Here.
Christopher Walker,
Here.
and I know I saw Max. Okay, so perfect. I'm not sure if I have to do that every week or just this week, but I do. So there we go.
Did you call my name?
Who said that? Joe? Yes.
Show's here.
Yes, yeah, I remembered you. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm not sure why I had to do that, but they told me I have to fill out a form after class today. So I will. Okay, we're gonna talk about ownership and entities. So we went through some heavy stuff. It's a little less heavy now, just for a bit. But that last part for joint ownership is a heavy thing. That's like a whole 2 weeks in law school. So if it was a little confusing, that's okay. Just understand and really the takeaway is when multiple parties own property, it's tenants in common, divisible equal shares or separate shares if it's specified, different amounts. And there's two other ways they can own it. One is joint tenants by survivorship, meaning that the survivor keeps the property and the heirs don't inherit. Another one is by the family. So that's really the takeaway on that. And that really does come up a lot. okay? Because, I mean, think about it. You know, if you buy, like say an investment property, do you want your heirs to get it or do you want your partner to get it? You know, let's say you're doing it in your own name. Okay, so that's the takeaway on that. So corporations, limited liability companies, partnerships, limited partnerships, land trust, trusts, estates, and as trustee are different ways that people will try to take property. So to start this off with is that certain business entities are considered legal people for many purposes. So corporations, limited liability companies, partnerships, limited partnerships are all forms of business entities that can be registered with the state or various states that can own property in their own name. They can bring suit in their own name and they can express political speech in their own name. They are legal entities, okay? Obviously, parts of the law that concern human people, not legal people, won't apply. Like a corporation doesn't have a will. Okay, a corporation doesn't go to probate, but there's equivalents, believe it or not, but they don't go to probate. Okay, but they can own property. Okay, so how this would look, the grantor would be Gary, and the grantee would be Natalie Inc., a Florida corporation. Okay, for example. Now, under these ownership, this isn't even that really, I don't think this is that heavy of a concept. Under that ownership, they have to do and deal with all of the other things that apply. So, you know, waste, paying their taxes, following the rules, that sort of thing all applies. They just own it as in a company. Okay, actually, and limited liability companies are a very common way to own real estate. Okay, and there's some advantages to it. I'm going to go over a few, and I'm going to give you a little piece. But before we do, I'm going to go ahead and then I'm going to come back to this slide. Okay, and we will get to land trust, trusts, estates, and as trustee. Actually, you know what, I'm going to deal with as trustee right now because it's a little blip, but it was on the syllabus. If you deed it to Desiree as trustee, but it doesn't specify of what trust, who the benefit is for, anything like that, just, you know, Gary to Desiree as trustee. Under that Florida statute, don't worry about the statute number. I do not ever test on statute numbers. It doesn't mean anything. It just means Desiree owns it in her own name. Okay, so if you are going to deed something to a trust, it's got to say more than the trustee's name. So, and I'll give you an example. And in order to understand this, you have to understand that a trust is not a business entity. It's not a legal person. It's a set of papers. It's an agreement. It's a contract. So trusts cannot own anything. Okay, and that's very important. Okay, people mess this up all the time. Truly, trusts don't and cannot own a blessed thing because they are nothing more than some papers that are signed and stapled together. Okay, however, trustees of a trust own property subject to all the rules of the trust. And in order for you to understand this concept, I'm going to have to back up a little bit, I think, looking around the best I can in the room. Okay, so what's a trust? Okay, very simply, in its simplest form, if I give Desiree $10 and ask her to give it to Kip when she sees him, I've created a trust. I am giving someone legal ownership of the $10, Desiree, for the benefit of someone, Kip. I'm the settlor or the grantor. Desiree is the trustee, the legal owner. Kip is the beneficiary. That triangle creates a trust. That's a very, very simple trust without a written agreement. You can create written agreements that make that much more complicated and useful. So if I want to set up as the grantor or settlor, their words are interchangeable for trusts, a very sophisticated trust for my kids and my grandkids, who I think it's very important they never smoke and that they attend certain colleges, and I want them to own my mansion and my zillion-dollar yacht, but only if they follow these rules and as long as they don't get married to whatever it is, as long as it's non-discriminatory, legal, et cetera. I can set up an agreement where I give a trustee, heck, maybe even myself, while I'm alive, and then successors after I pass, legal ownership of these, but not for themselves, for them to use it in a trusted position known as a fiduciary for the benefit of all of those beneficiaries, my kids, my grandkids, my great-grandkids, in 20 generations to come, as long as we don't have to deal with that. For a certain period of time that's allowed by law, that's fine. And my trustee and the beneficiaries, for that matter, everybody, and for that matter, including me as the grantor, have to abide by all of the legal rules that we set out in the trust. Okay, so a perfect example of this is, let's say you have a kid that, you're getting a little older and you got a kid and your kid needs some help because your kid's got some problems and doesn't spend money well and likes to, hit the old meth pipe or whatever. But, the kid needs care and you got a lot of money. So you're worried that when you pass away, you don't want to be transferring, your business and whatnot and all your riches to this kid so he can go and, blow it all in a Ferrari and a gold plated, meth pipe. Okay, you don't want that. So you set up a trust that says, okay, I'm going to have my trusted friend here hold on to this money for the health, wealth, care, education, maintenance of my kid under these conditions. And then the trustee would become the legal owner of these bank accounts and could dole out, per the rules of the trust in good faith, money as appropriate to pay for the, the rehab and the Honda Accord, not the Lamborghini, or whatever, the housing for the kid, but not just what the kid wants. No gold meth pipes, right? Or whatever. I don't know enough about meth to know if you use a pipe. Okay. So that's like where a trust can come in really useful. A trust can also become in very useful, okay, when you set it up to avoid probate. Now we talk a lot about avoiding probate. And the reason we talk about avoiding probate, you kind of have to know a little bit about what probate is. After someone dies, any assets that they remain go to their estate. Look, see, I included that word, estates. Okay, and their estate becomes the owner of all of their assets by operation of law. Okay, so this estate then needs to be administered. In other words, you got to go through a procedure of what to do with all those assets. That procedure is probate. So when someone talks about probate, it's simply the procedure to deal with someone who died's remaining assets. In that procedure, it's court supervised. The executor, which we call in Florida a personal representative, okay, the executor marshals or puts together all of the assets, pays everyone who's supposed to get paid in a certain order. Okay, funeral parlor first, attorney second, which proves that funeral parlors have a better lobby than attorneys. Okay, doctors, creditors, everybody else that's owed money, and then the heirs or the beneficiaries if there's a will, the people that are set out in the will. Okay, if there's no will, then the heirs in a certain order set by statute, which means that guess who gets the money last? Your kids, the people you want to get the money. Therefore, people spend a lot of money devising and setting up ways to avoid probate, because the only assets that go through probate are the assets that remain in your name when you pass away. So how do you avoid this? Well, you can set up a life estate deed. You can set up a joint tenant with right of survivorship. You can have bank accounts as joint tenants or life estates. So that's how you avoid it. Okay, you can also use trusts. Okay, one of the most common forms is a revocable trust or a living trust. You will encounter this constantly, both in trusts in general, but also revocable trusts, both in residential and commercial real estate developments and transactions. Okay, and a revocable trust is kind of a legal fiction. In a revocable trust, I give my stuff to me as the trustee, for me as the beneficiaries. I am all three sides of the triangle. I no longer own the property as Gary. I own the property as Gary, the trustee, for the benefit of Gary, the beneficiary. okay, in different legal capacities, right? Which makes no difference while I'm alive. It's from me, to me, for me. I can do whatever I want. But when I die, the trust also sets forth who's going to be the next trustee and who are going to be the next beneficiaries. So at the moment of my death, Gary is no longer the trustee. Now Bob is the trustee, my trusted friend. And Gary is no longer the beneficiary, my kids are. Since Bob now owns the property under these rules, which say, give all this stuff to my kids, and my kids are the beneficiaries who are now my kids, I don't have to go through probate, creditors can't touch it. That's why you do revocable trusts. Okay, because at the moment of your death, you can't revoke it anymore because you're dead. It becomes an irrevocable trust, and that by its own terms, the trust will execute and tell the new trustee to transfer the property to the new beneficiary. In a nutshell, that's all a revocable or living trust is. Okay, now for property ownership, Gary, the trustee of the Gary Singer Revocable Trust dated 9/9/19 is the owner, not Gary Singer, the person. Okay, when I die, Bob, successor trustee of the Gary Singer Revocable Trust under agreement dated 9/9/19, becomes the legal owner by operational law. And when, just so you know, when I say by operational law, it means you don't have to do anything. It just happens. It's automatic. Does anyone have questions on the basics of trusts? Because, man, I'll tell you what, there's entire year-long classes about it. So I'm just hitting the basics. Or revocable trusts. Anyone have questions about what you said? Yes, please.
Do revocable trusts offer some sort of additional protection for the owner? Is that like why
No.
someone would?
They don't actually. I think you're asking about is like creditor protection.
I guess I'm just asking in general why someone would do that, and if there's some sort of legal benefit to doing it.
Yes. Well, the two legal benefits, two main benefits. There's lots of benefits in that you can. Well, I guess there's three main benefits. Okay. The three main benefits are: number one, you avoid probate, which means you avoid paying all of the creditors and expenses of probate from attorneys, credit card companies, accountants, filing fees, and the year it takes to do it. All of that gets avoided when you die. Okay. While you're alive, you have some amount of additional privacy as to what's owned because it's not directly in your name. Okay, so you have that benefit. And you have a benefit of a certain flexibility of how what you own is dealt with in other aspects besides those based on the agreement, which sounds like legal mumbo jumbo, but the point being that trusts are as limitless as the imagination of the people creating them are. So various types of trusts can be used in incredibly creative ways, like magnificently, like some that I've seen in drafted trusts that, I do trusts. I've drafted what's called double-blind anonymity trusts. So South Americans, if people if you know any South Americans, when they live down there, if they run into town and they're very high wealth individuals, they're going to drive a beat up old Corolla. They're not like America where they're driving in town in the Bentley because they don't want their kids to get kidnapped. Okay, and people who would do the kidnapping are pretty sophisticated nowadays. So they know how to go in Florida and look up the public records to see that what people own. And they also know how to go into the corporate records and see what corporations people own to own property. Okay. However, when you have a trust and that person's not the trustee, maybe their attorney is, there's no way to know who owns that, really. You just know who the legal owner is. So that anonymity, and then if you take it a step further and you go to like Wyoming, where not even the state knows who the beneficiaries are, and you use a second state's trust to own the trust, to own the stuff. So you have 2 states worth of protection. It's all becomes, which is called a double blind. It becomes almost impossible, even with, you need 2 court orders in 2 states to find out who actually owns the property. So they can be very creative. And the reason you do that typically, not for bad reasons, because that would be unethical. It's usually truly for anonymity protection, because there's people in certain places in the world that if they own, you know, $1 million mansion on Miami Beach or a multi-million-dollar mansion on Miami Beach, they really, it's not good for them or their family if it's find outable. Okay, so that's like another, the flexibility is a great reason for it. And you'll often see development companies and investors using trusts for not a simple revocable trust, but like a more complicated trust for a variety of reasons, all relating to creditor protection and flexibility. Now, the way it works with any property ownership, when you're talking about like creditor liability or whatever, is liability and control are on an inverse scale. And what it means is the more you have control over the asset, the more liable you are for it. Meaning that if you own a house and someone trips and falls, you're getting sued. Okay? But if you don't have any control over that house, let's say you're just the beneficiary of a trust, you're not going to get sued personally because you have no control over the house. Okay, so if you're a very high wealth individual and you have legacy money, in other words, money and assets you're never going to need while you're alive, and you want to make sure no one can take it from you, or really from your kids, you put it into an irrevocable trust that you can't touch anymore for the benefit of your children. So now your creditors can't touch it because you have no control over it. It's not yours anymore, the trust's. And your children's creditors can't touch it because it's up to the discretion of the trustee, right? And if that trustee and that trust happens to be sitting in another country, it doesn't really matter what a Florida judge says. So you'll oftentimes see developers use trusts, whether it's directly or having the trust own the interest in the company that owns the property, to protect their personal interests and afford massive flexibility. Okay, very complicated answer to a very good question. Did everyone get that? And this is why you see, I know it's hardcore, but this is why you see trusts so much in real estate, because they're very flexible. But the revocable or living trust, the one they sell on, Susie sells on late night TV, can or isn't necessarily a great idea for people, but that's used just to avoid probate, because since the grantor, the person, is also, while they're alive, the trustee, they have full control, which means they still have full liability. So a living trust doesn't give you any liability protection whatsoever, but it does avoid probate. Make sense? Okay. And like, so for example, to be really complicated, but give you an idea of how this stuff is useful in real life, and this won't be on the test. For many clients who own multiple properties, I will have each property be owned by a limited liability company. The limited liability companies be owned by a single corporation to make filing taxes easier, and the corporation to be owned by a trustee. Okay, so that way I get the best of all worlds. I have each property owned individually, which means the creditors of each property can't get past that property to the other properties. I have single level taxation, since limited liability companies don't have to necessarily get taxed individually. And then I have a trust to deal with all the back end. And that's, you know, I won't say it's common, but that's a fairly common way real estate investors structure ownership. That way, if the project fails, they don't lose everything. They only lose that project. Okay, that's not going to be on the test, but just a real world example of how this all comes into play and what you guys are trying to do. Okay, so a corporation is kind of the oldest form of fictitious business person. Okay, business entity. Okay, it's one that's been around the longest. And a corporation is just a fictional legal person that individual people or other entities own shares of stock. And I think everyone's pretty familiar with that concept. Okay, a partnership is anytime two people, actually, you know what, let me go here, because I have this. This I actually got from your textbook, which is why it says copyrighted. And as I said, John, anything you need from your textbook, I'll bring forward. So this is one of those examples. So a corporation is a legal entity that can issue shares representing fractional ownership interest. It's created by filing an incorporation with the Secretary of State. It limits the liabilities to the owners, and it's governed generally by directors. And what that means is that the owners only own shares. They don't control the company, even though an owner can also be a director, but they're considered different. So their risk of losing the liability, let's say someone gets hurt or the bank, whatever, the business goes out, is limited to their ownership. You can't touch their personal assets. It's creating a moat, a firewall, shield between the business entity and the individual owners of that business entity. Okay, that's corporation. Whoops. Okay, a general partnership. Okay, a partnership is just when two people are doing something together. Okay, you don't need to do anything to form a general partnership. You just have to do something together. You know, like Alec, you and me, let's split a pizza. We just formed a partnership. We put our money together for the ownership and consumption of a pizza. We have a partnership. Okay, we're both individually liable to pay and individually liable to pay. Okay, boom, that's a partnership. Now, obviously, you can get a lot more sophisticated than that. You can register with the state, in which case they take on certain portions and protections like a corporation, but it's really just two or more persons, which can also be businesses, to carry on business for profit as co-owners. The partners are equally responsible for the debt obligations of the partnership, and a general partnership does not offer any liability protection. So if Alec and I are driving to the pizza parlor and we run someone over, we're both getting sued. Doesn't matter that we were doing it as a partnership. Okay, but there is tax advantages. Okay, now since that kind of sucks, because who wants to get sued? You create a limited partnership. In this, there's two types of partners. There's general partners and limited partners. Okay, the general partner has liability for the debts and obligations of the limited partnership, of the, you know, in other words, of the endeavor. The limited partner has limited liability. Limited partnerships are governed by the general partners. Okay, and there's like state law affecting it. So to use this in a ridiculous real world example, we decide that we're going to have Kip. Kip's going to be the limited partner, the general partner, and Alec and I are going to be the limited partners. We're going to invest in Kip as the general partner, driving to the pizza parlor and getting the pizza for us. Kip is going to do it. He's going to have all the liability if you run someone over, plus the responsibilities of buying the pizza with our money and bringing it back to us. If he does run someone over, since Alec and I are limited partners, we don't have any liability because the general partner did it. So why would Kip ever want to be a general partner? Well, Kip wouldn't. Kip's smart. So Kip forms a corporation of which he owns the shares to go get the pizza. And that way that corporation provides him the liability protection, and now there's no one to sue beyond the money for the pizza or the pizza itself. That's why you have limited partnerships. Make sense? Okay, why would you do this? It offers oftentimes more flexibility on the back end than corporations do for investments. Okay, you also have something called a limited liability limited partnership, which limits everyone's liability by statute. They're very complex, outside of the scope of this class, and expensive, but they're often used by investors. Same idea of what we just talked about as limited partnership, but with more rules and more power. Okay, so it's not really worth overly discussing. Okay, and then you have a limited liability company. Okay, limited liability company is basically if you took a corporation and a general partnership and put them in a blender, you have a limited liability company. It has all of the tax advantages of a partnership and all of the liability protection of a corporation. Okay, and it's a fictitious state filing. It doesn't happen by accident, in other words, like a partnership. So it has to be filed with the Secretary of State. Okay, the major, and you see a lot of LLCs, or limited liability companies, because in most ways they're better than either a corporation or a partnership. And they're a lot cheaper to set up than a limited liability company, limited liability, limited partnership, which actually in reality is an LLC crossed with partnership, with some of the protections, like all of them in a blender, like a Long Island iced tea, so to speak. The limited liability company, the only downside to a limited liability company, there's only one, because everything else in it's better than either of the other ones, is that a single member limited liability company, meaning only one person owns all of the interest in it, does not offer liability protection in Florida. It does in other states, but not in Florida. Okay, and that's why you see a little less of them now, because you don't ever want to own a limited liability company alone anymore. Okay, and that's just a case came out that basically the judge said, no, it's just too bad you have liability protection. You don't have it anymore for your sole member.
Is there a way around that?
Yeah, you put a second person on, or you use a corporation. Or you have the one member be a corporation. So that way you get a second level protection.
So you just add another, I don't know, just put another member in the articles?
Absolutely. One of the most common ways, you have a 99.9% owner and a 0.1% owner. And then you have two people, you get the liability protection back. But then you have a 0.1% minority owner, which has its own issues. It's a disadvantage that popped up about 10 years ago. Alec, had a question too, or no?
Yeah, just quickly, could you say again your preferred or the standard practice of having each development site under an LLC, and then what did you say?
Yeah, sure. So basically, this is a test, but a very common method. And for those of you who saw that old movie with Tom Berenger, Sniper, one shot, one kill, that's kind of the theory here. You have each individual property is owned by a limited liability company. Okay, and the reason being that way, if someone, let's say, trips and falls in that rental house, they can only sue the one company. They can only get to the assets of that one company because everything else is shielded behind the wall of the limited liability protection. Okay, so you don't want it to spread. So you own 10 properties, you own each one in a separate LLC. However, filing 10 tax returns is a giant pain in the neck. So since with a limited liability company, you have the tax advantages of a partnership, I didn't say what those were. What they are is that you can roll it up into your individual tax return and not file taxes individually for the corporation. When you have a corporation, it has to file its own taxes and pay its own taxes. Limited liability companies don't have to do that.
And then you said that there is another way to do it is to have a governing
The next step of that is, because number one, you don't want single member limited liability companies, okay, and because you don't want to deal with having 10 individual levels of taxation, which is a pain in the neck. You have a corporation own all 100% of each of the companies, each of the limited liability companies. That way, all of the money rolls from and accumulates in this corporation, your holding company, and that's the only tax return you have to file. You follow? That way you're not filing 10 tax returns and keeping 10 sets of books. You're keeping one set of books, filing one tax return, and then just records on 10 properties, 10 companies that corporation owns.
So you're creating one silo per property, and then they all feed one S corp, let's call it.
Well, it wouldn't be an S corp, and it would be a C corp most of the time, occasionally an S corp. But yes, and by S and C, those are just tax classifications. A small company can elect to be a small company, a small corporation, excuse me, can elect for small status, S status, which means that it doesn't get taxed on an individual basis. The owners get taxed, the profits. However, there's a lot of qualifications to become an S corp. The biggest one being everyone has to be citizens or resident aliens. So if you have a non-resident or any foreign ownership, you can't have an S corp. Which is why, since there's usually foreign money in big projects, you see a lot more LLCs than S corps. It's also limited to a certain number of owners, certain size, etc. Okay, so that is like a hybrid corporation that has some of the advantages of partnership, which is that flow through taxation. But, you know, it has some of the protections. So typically, depending on the size of your play. So if you're someone who owns like 10 rental houses and you live here, you know, it probably will be an S Corp holding company. But if you're like Styles, it's going to be a C Corp. Or whatever, it's a tenth of the size of Styles, whatever.
Professor.
And again, that's not on the test. That's just to answer your question. That's really complicated. But I wanted to give an example of how these are really used. That makes sense. I hope I didn't confuse anybody.
No, those are the best, the real world applications, right?
Yeah, well, that's even so you know why you're learning this stuff, right? Why do I care about limited liability companies? Because most people own individual properties in limited liability companies. And for other reasons, most of those limited liability companies aren't owned by individuals, they're owned by companies, corporations, typically. Okay. So yeah, that's why this is important. And each of these are tools, right? It's almost like, you know, you got those tool belts on like carpenter. Depending on the application, boom, LLC, boom, land trust, boom, whatever. Okay, you pick it out. You know, you're not, every problem's not a nail and every tool's not a hammer. Sometimes you need a drill, sometimes whatever. Okay, I'm a lawyer. I don't know any other tools besides those two. He does an air thing. Actually, that's a joke. I actually grew up working in a small appliance repair store, so I actually know how to do things, unlike most lawyers. So you got corporation, limited liability companies, limited partnerships. You also have something called a land trust. I am not going to belabor land trusts overly, even though you guys hear about them all the time. A land trust is okay, so we talked about common law and the way things have been done for 1,000 years. Okay, there's also things that are just get made up for its purpose because someone has a good lobby. So Walt Disney decided he wanted to buy up lots of property in Central Florida, but he didn't want all the adjoining people to know he was doing it because then they'd raise their prices. So he wanted to do it secretly. So he talked, or his lawyers, the legislature into adopting something they use in Illinois and not many other places called a statutory land trust. Okay, and a statutory land trust is a very special type of trust created only under statutory authority. In other words, it's made up by the legislature, whose sole purpose and use is owning land in a way that no one has to or should look at the underlying legal agreements. In other words, if you come to your closing attorney or title agent and you're using a trust, they're going to ask for a copy of the trust agreement. They need it to see what everyone's powers are. With a land trust, no one gets to see that. Okay, so because all of the powers are listed in a special way by statute on the deed. Here's who the trustee is, here's who the successor trustee is, here's who the successor to the successors, here's all their powers. Here's the statute where it says you really don't care who the beneficiaries are. Okay, and they're complicated. That's all a land trust is. It's all a land trust is good for. It's all a land trust does. It protects the identity of the underlying beneficial owner. Okay, which is why they're good and is also why they're bad. Okay, so they're good because Walt Disney can go scoop up lots of land and make Disney World, and we get to go on Space Mountain. Okay, without him spending too much money to afford it, and then it would be the size of Disneyland instead of Disney World. So that was good. It's bad when flippers use them incorrectly, die without a named successor, causing their family to go and have to hire expensive attorneys to have multi-year litigation to figure out what's owned and who gets it. And it's bad because they use it through flips, so all land trusts get a bad name with lenders and other people in the industry, and no one likes it. So like any other tool, it's good when used properly. And it can be very useful for certain things, and it's often used improperly, and because of it has a very bad reputation. I mean, to the point where like back in the short sale days, the buyer was not, if you had a buyer who was a land trust or an owner of a land trust, or there was a land trust involved, or anyone said the word land trust, your short sale died. That's how bad of a reputation they have. Okay, if you thought about a land trust, lender would cancel. That being said, they're very often used very well by large companies, developers, for certain reasons. So they're still a good tool. They're just often misused. Okay, that's a land trust. We talked about trusts. And when someone dies, we talked about estates owning the property. And what that means is that the personal representative of the estate, the executor, we call it personal reps here in Florida, owns the property until they get it to the person it's supposed to. Okay, so and that's ownership of entities in a very large nutshell. Question on ownership of entities.
So what I'm hearing on the land trust from a developer's perspective is that it really should be utilized for large assemblages of land.
That's it. That was its intended original purpose. There are certainly other good reasons to use it. It could be a large assemblage of sophisticated investors where you don't want to deal with a certain reportings that are not required by law, but you would need to do if it was a corporation. They're really used for anonymity of the underlying investor. Okay, kind of the way I was using double blind trusts and whatnot, just another method to do that. I prefer the blind trust method because it doesn't have the stink. The problem is, I like land trusts. I've written many and they're complicated. I get to charge a good amount of money to do it right, and they can be very useful because, not only do you have to do the land trust deed, which is multi-page and complicated, you got to do the trustee agreement, you got to do the beneficiary agreement, and you got to explain it, which takes a couple hours. So it's good for certain purposes to provide anonymity in a certain way, but it was so misused for a period of time that it got a really bad name to it. Kind of like reverse mortgages, which we'll talk about in another class. But reverse mortgages are a fantastic tool for a small subset of people. They're a terrible tool for other people. They were overused, misused for the benefit of the, mortgage broker, let's say. So they got a bad name, and now even people who it would help avoid them, even though they're great for those people. It's the right tool for the right job. So a land trust is the right tool for a certain small minority of transactions, but it was used improperly, and they kind of got a bad rap.
Could you use a land trust and assemble land and then dissolve it? Or is it a difficult process?
No, it's not actually. What you would do is use a land trust to have multiple owners of land, but realistically, the beneficial owner of the land is all that one company, and then you would just deed it all into the main company at the end. It's basically a private way of creating a trust to own property, certain statutory restrictions. And when that trust owns the property, you can do anything like any other property. So yeah, and it's often used. I mean, again, the initial intention was to own land. A lot of the things it's really good for have been superseded by newer, better ways to do it. You know what I mean? So like when it was made, it was like the only way really to do that. But now there's other ways that don't have the downsides. Still used, but oftentimes still wrong. But there are still certain use cases, where it would be a good choice. There's lots of ways to do it. You can hammer in the nail, with a hammer, or you do it with the side of your wrench. The nail is going to go in, but what's going to work better? The wrench, obviously. No, kidding. Okay, so I think we'll take a 10-minute break and come back at 10. How's that sound?
Sounds
Awesome.
good.
See you guys in 9 minutes. I got a bad back, so. This is all connected, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's I do it every day, so I don't even think about it, but when I'm going through it, I realize it's a heavy concept sometimes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if it was my first time hearing some of it, I would definitely be sort of a lot of questions, but thankfully I was correct. Yeah. Not entirely foreign to me.
No, that's good.
When someone is the executor of someone else's estate, do they take on any liability as well?
Not personal liability, unless they step way out of bounds. You know, so they take on liability to do the job in the appropriate way. But no more than that.
Yeah, a friend of ours.
They're a fiduciary, what they call a fiduciary. So they're responsible to the people that they're supposed to, but they're not like, you know, if someone trips and falls and the personal representative owns it, they're not gonna sue properly, at least. The personal rep individually, they're gonna sue the personal rep on behalf of the state.
So if the personal rep, you know, now owns the property, they're liable for paying for the property?
No, the state is.
The estate.
Yeah, they're like an official, they're representing.
And my dad was assigned to be the personal representative for a family friend.
Yeah,
In case he passes away or anything, my dad's the one who tried to.
yeah, now there's no, you're just like a rep. It's like being like the president of the company.
Mhm.
Now, if you do your job mostly right, they can, you know, something happens, they go after the company, not after you. So the people you're really answering to are the beneficiaries, the heirs.
Okay.
Yeah, but no, you don't, fortunately, and that same goes for trustees and whatnot. You know, they're called, representative or fiduciary roles. Lawyers have too many big words.
And then about the Lady Bird estate, deed. If I was looking at, my client's will or deed, how would I be able to identify whether it's regular life estate or Lady Bird estate?
By the words on it.
Would it specifically literally say like Lady Bird estate? Or how would that work?
Sometimes it says enhanced. I put titles on mine to be clear. Well, the real difference is you determine how property is owned by the words vesting the property, the words on the deed.
Okay.
So a life estate deed would read grantor to grantee for life, and then to remainder. Boom. A ladybird would read grantor to grantee for life, without liability for waste, and the right to encumber without joinder for remainder, and then to. So it's reserving back powers into the life estate, life tenant, that would normally go into. So if you read it, it's very good.
Okay.
So basically, a ladybird is a life estate with.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad I understand that now. Because
It's huge,
I
I'll tell
I
you.
was so confused at first and the whole deal was kind of huge that they were dealing with, you know, the older lady who was selling the property, her daughter, her daughter was a, she was a two-by-four property. And she foresaw this, so she put it in that state. So then she came to us, she said, oh, you know, I'm selling the property and I looked at the tax records and said such and such like the state and then her daughter's name. So my question.
You gotta look at the
I
actual
was
deed.
raising was, are you sure you're the only one that needs to sign this? Because typically it's.
Exactly, you gotta look at the actual deed. And that's why, because like, I don't mind using my own example, my mom passed away a few years ago, but when we bought the property, I actually helped her to buy the property, you know, in the pocket. So, you know, she wanted to be sure that when she passed, you know, I got the property. But it was her property, yeah. You know, so if she wanted to put a mortgage on it, she wanted to sell it, I didn't want to limit her power. So we set up a ladybird deed for her, so she had all the power she wanted to change her mind, because, you know, I still have the power. But if she didn't, then I didn't need to. You're from Ecuador?
My mom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have so many clients.
Oh, yeah.
Very, very well, I can't say their names, but people like your mom's name, in a good or bad.
Yeah, no.
High wealth and high power.
Okay,
people,
yeah.
Either there still or
Yeah.
the change, like your mom did.
I know a few last names, so sure.
I know a lot of people. I don't know how I fell into that group.
A lot of stuff going on in that business.
It's
Big world.
it's a part of the world. It's cool. It's interesting. Yeah, nice people. Though.
Yeah, no, I think I was, a year ago today, I was coming back from
Mhm. Oh, okay. Oh, nice. Where'd you go? Up or down? Ocean or mountains?
It's not.
Okay.
I've actually never been to the ocean park.
Okay. Beautiful.
Been to the mountains, but I came back and.
Yeah, they've had some issues. Yeah, depending on who you ask, good or bad.
Yeah, no, I mean, COVID was the worst one there.
Good you got back.
I want that bread and made it back.
Oh, you went in March? Oh, God. I was actually on a cruise. I was on the last cruise. Like literally, we got in and they closed the ship.
Oh.
It was so, you were doing such a job. That's one in the elevators, Washington, constantly. We're just watching on the news, going, oh my gosh, I didn't know that's it. There's 5,000 people. We were literally the last world cruise. That came into Orlando, thank goodness, because the one in Miami was yeah.
Yeah, when I was there, people were really saying, oh, COVID.
Yeah.
What are we gonna do?
No one knew. Yeah, that's good. It's good you got back though.
Yeah.
You could have been stuck there for a long time. That's cool. Yeah, but very nice people, very nice country, very interesting.
Are we on a break?
I was just thinking the same thing.
Hey, yeah,
Natalie.
we're on a break.
Natalie's teaching.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe someday.
So what's the craziest story you had this year, Natalie?
Real estate story?
Yeah.
Craziest real estate story I had this year. Let's see. Had some crazy ones.
It's only 2 months worth.
Oh, 2 months worth. Ooh, that's a hard one. I have a lot of crazy stuff happening. I had a client looking for a rental for like $8,000. Mind you, I only work residential, but they came back to us and they said that because the association was taking too long to approve them for the property, that they were going to get a divorce. So stuff like that has happened.
That doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, so there's a lot of like family and like relational things that go on that sort of affect how things happen and stuff. But it's all good. I enjoy it.
So yesterday's strategic forum meeting was good.
Oh yeah, how was it?
Great guest speakers.
Good, very good.
Jeff is starting a lot of different things right now.
Awesome. Yeah, I wish I could have attended.
Oh, George is in the class, right? George? George. Can we invite George as a guest observer?
I have to run it through the chain of decision making. But send me an email and I'd be happy to see what I can do.
Finally met the guy. After months of working together. We Zoom thing, you don't get to meet all your classmates.
Oh really? Oh, I'm sure. Because you don't come down too often, right?
Nope.
Oh man.
Max and I had a nice outing this weekend. We got to check out a couple sites.
Let's just say there won't be a second date.
No, you stood me up. I even brought flowers.
Kept you on? Nah, I kept on.
All right, we're gonna get going. Is everyone back? All right, Byron, Annabelle, or Charlisa, speak up if you're here, please.
I'm
Charlisa?
here,
Who's that?
Annabelle.
Okay, good, good. I missed you before. Perfect, thank you. Byron, Charlisa, Granberry. Okay, we're gonna get started again. Hopefully everyone's back. Actually, I'll give everyone another 15 seconds while I explode a bottle of sparkling water. All right. Don't be afraid of title commitment, because I have a very bad sense of humor. Title insurance 101, switching gears. Okay. What is title? What is title insurance? The process, the commitment, owner versus loan policies, exceptions to coverage, premiums. I'm skipping attorney versus non-attorney, and fraud, and which I'm probably going to avoid a little too. Just so you know, a lot of my material I use from real life. So this actually comes from a presentation I've made many times to realtors. Okay. Why have title insurance? Imagine closing on the dream home you bought. Now imagine finding out a few months or years later, someone else owns it or has a claim to it. That would stink. Houses are expensive, so are buildings. Okay. What is title? When we talk about title, we talk about a bundle of rights, a bundle of sticks is how it's referred to in the case law, hence the bundle of sticks, that are the rights of ownership and possession over a particular property. Before title can be sold, it must be, and these are just legal words, marketable, which means free and clear of liens or other title defects that would be unacceptable to a prudent, educated buyer in the reasonable course of business. What does that mean? It means that marketable title is good title. It's the title that a buyer would expect to get. It's not perfect. It's not 100% power because you have easements, you have FPL lines, you have neighborhood restrictions, you have government regulations, you may have a roadway running over the side of your property or a drainage ditch that, so those are all things that fritter away at your 100%, but those are normal, they're acceptable, they're fine. So as long as it's only that stuff, it's considered marketable. But Gary, who decides what's marketable? Anyone want to take a guess at that? It's pretty easy. Anyone? Guess at who decides what's marketable?
The lender?
Yes. Go ahead.
The owner. The owner does.
Okay, good guess, not correct, but good guess. Anyone else?
The lender?
Good guess, not correct. Tax assessed or property appraiser, good guess, not correct. Well, all these could be correct if, but on their own, not correct.
Anyone.
Okay. Who?
Just throwing stuff.
Yeah, say again.
I just said anyone.
See, this was all a good opportunity for you guys to suck up to the professor a little bit because I decide.
The lawyer.
Okay. Me, literally, I decide is what market. Not because I'm Gary, but because I am a prudent real estate attorney in the local market who has examined title and is making a decision based on acceptable standards. That is who decides what marketable title is. It's what's accepted by prudent, what would be accepted by prudent, educated buyer in a reasonable course of business. Okay, and the person who decides that is real estate attorneys. So what I'm saying is that, and the reason I'm bringing this to light, it's not like a car where you get a certificate, you sign the back of it, and the next person owns it. Someone has to look at the records and the situation and the facts and determine who owns the property and what the quality of that ownership is, whether or not it's marketable. it really is a bundle of sticks because there's no like registry. You think you can go look at the property appraiser's website? That's just a website. It doesn't, sometimes it's right. I like Marty. I went to school with him. He's actually a very good property appraiser. We're very lucky in Broward County. Very smart attorney, but he's not the judge of it because he's the property appraiser. The judge of it is the in the field, in area real estate attorney looking at the standards, of which I guess the property appraiser is one. Okay, so it doesn't matter what it says on the website if it's wrong. It matters if it's right. So that's what marketable is. It's good title. And there's no like central registry. That's why we have things like title searches, title insurance, because Gary decides, Gary and his peers. Okay, what is title insurance? So we talked about title exams, we look at the records, but not everything's findable. Not all these defects are able to be found. They could be hidden, whether or not found in the course of a title search or asking the city. They're just not really knowable because they're hidden. Title insurance protects against problems that you didn't know about, typically that couldn't be known about when you bought the property. Okay, and it's insurance because if a problem is discovered, the title insurance company, just like State Farm, these are giant billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar insurance companies, pay to fix it, whether it's to go to court to fix it or to cover the financial loss. Okay, and they really do. I mean, in many ways, I had one case, I'm laughing because it was kind of a funny case, where I had a client who bought a property from a bank that foreclosed it. It was a house on 5 acres plus the next 5 acres. Okay, and when he bought it, he got a title insurance property. But it turned out later that the bank didn't foreclose on the second half of the property, the other 5 acres. So technically, since the bank only owned the first 5 acres, that's all they can convey to the buyer. So he only got 5 acres, but he had a title insurance policy. So we made a claim, and without too much trouble, the insurance company went out and bought the other 5 acres and gave it to him because he had insurance for it. And now he had 10 acres for the price of 5 or whatever. Okay, so that's really how it works. Okay, it's also very good if someone makes a false claim. I have a case going on right now where I can't comment on if it's active, but basically someone's making a frivolous claim. You know, they're making a wrongful claim. So that the title insurance company, the insurer, is stepping up to pay for the attorney to fix and fight that frivolous claim. Okay, and that's why you get title insurance. Examples of hidden defects: forged deeds, never happens in South Florida. Identity theft and sarcasm for those of you who don't know. Identity theft, impersonation, a married seller who represents themselves at single. See, that just doesn't happen in the bar. It also happens at conference rooms. Oh, come on, no one? That was a pretty good joke. Married people represent themselves at single, you know, conference. I've had that happen to me or try to happen to me many times. One time a person brought their wife with the driver's license and you looked at it and they weren't the same person by a couple of decades based on the driver's license. Like there's no plastic surgeon good enough to do that. And we're like, sorry, we're not going forward on this one. It was like, so like I guess they were hoping we wouldn't really look at the driver's license. It was so off. So people try stuff like that. I'm laughing because I literally remember that. What are you talking about? Like, really? Was it her daughter? Undisclosed heirs, deeds signed by minors or mentally incompetent people, confusion created by common names. You know, that you can see where that would happen. I see someone I think had something. Does title insurance cover mineral rights or water rights? Maybe. We'll get into that. Good question, though, Alec. Okay, these are hidden defects. Okay, these are things that can't be found. Okay, it also covers discoverable defects that weren't discovered. Okay, and then you ask, well, why? I got the attorney to malpractice. Well, what if the attorney dies or goes out of business? You're not going to get very far with that. Unpaid mortgages, unpaid property taxes, unpaid HOA dues, improperly probated wills, construction liens, court judgments, etc. If all these pop up after you take ownership, the insurance covers it. Okay, how does the insurance process work? And it really is kind of the same for the title part of the closing. First, you do a title search and a title examination. It used to be back in the day, you'd get a property abstract. And an abstract would go to the courthouse, dig through the books, and they were literal tomes, boom, like out of a movie. And they make a report that was very complicated. It would take a couple days. And then someone would read that abstract and determine marketable title. Now we have computers and things are a lot simpler. We really don't use abstracts anymore. We use title searches, which are like computerized reports about ownership and the interests that refer you what to narrow it down. And then someone goes in and looks at that. And I want to be very clear, they don't just look at the computer records, they actually go look at the actual instruments, the deeds, the mortgages, the easements, whatever it may be from public records, get read and reviewed. And I've looked at tens of thousands of them. You really do look at it. You look at the property records and you also look at the personal records, the name records for 20 years to look for like personal judgments that could affect ownership, etc.
Why just 20 years?
Because judgments in Florida are typically only good for 20 years. That's a good question. So why just 20 years? And we'll talk a little bit about MRTA later, but I can hit on it now. MRTA is not murder. It's Marketable Record Title Act, MRTA, MRTA. And MRTA limits the amount of time you have to do a title search to 30 years plus one deed. So in other words, one base of title or deed older than 30 years is as far as you have to go back nowadays in most cases because of this law. So basically really old ownership really old problems, more than 30 years plus an instrument, go away, like they fade away with time. Okay, they're just called MRTA. So you don't have to go back to like literally, nature, God, whatever. Like you didn't need to. Like literally, you have to go all the way back until Florida became a state, where it got its power from the king, who transferred it to Florida, who transferred it to people. And you have to go all the way back that far to land patents. And I've actually read some of them, and they're hard to read because certain times MRTA doesn't apply. But they passed that law a long time ago, fortunately, and in most normal stuff you'll deal with, you don't got to go back past 30, 35 years. Okay, you also look at the taxes. You also look at do what's called a municipal lien search or lien letters, where you ask the city if they got any issues. You do code enforcement, permit searches. You look at court proceedings. You review foreclosure files, bankruptcy files, probates. So, for example, a lot of people don't know this. You got a little too loosey-goosey with the old credit card, decided to do a Chapter 7, but you already had a judgment against you from Chase Manhattan or Capital One or whatever, and you see it bankrupted off, but you owned a property. Well, that judgment might have formed a lien on your property, and that bankruptcy may get rid of the fact that you owe Capital One, but unless you took extra action in bankruptcy, which most people don't, the lien still exists. Okay, and people are very, very surprised. You get a one call a week. I went bankrupt 5 years ago. What do you mean there's a lien on my property? A week, one call a week. Well, yeah, but you didn't strip the lien in bankruptcy court. You stripped the debt. Okay, and I'll give you a little cool little tidbit that may help you later in life, and whether as a developer or personally. Bankruptcy does not get rid of debt. Okay, when you go bankrupt or someone goes bankrupt, the debt does not disappear. It only becomes unenforceable, which is a very key distinction. It means they can't collect on the debt anymore, but it still exists. Which means that if there was a lien on property, your property didn't go bankrupt. You did. So the personal part of the judgment is gone, but your property still has a lien. So if you understand the concept of enforceability, being destroyed by bankruptcy versus actual debt, and that's also the reason why you don't got to pay capital gains when you go bankrupt. Because the debt's still there, they just can't collect it. If it went away, you owe taxes. Okay, so very key. Now, in bankruptcy, you can get rid of liens. It's just an additional procedure, additional rules. Okay, so be aware of that. I've seen many, many investors get burnt. Oh, they went Chapter 7, we're good. They buy the property, maybe they don't get title insurance, which happens. Not smart, but happens. And they go to flip it, and you're like, oh no, you owe Capital One 30 grand, buddy. Right there on the pro, you went bankrupt. The property didn't. Okay, probate, etc. Okay, any questions on this up to now?
Yeah, Alex put one in the chat.
Oh, okay, Alec, let's see.
No,
Oh, yeah, mineral
he
rights,
already
we'll get to
addressed
mineral
it.
rights. We'll get to mineral rights in a minute. Okay, excellent. So after the search is done, the title company, title attorney issues a title commitment, reviews the survey, collects non-public information, payoffs, bills, estoppels from the association, puts it all together, gathers everyone up in their warm embracing arms, gets everyone on the same page, does the closing, disperses funds, records documents, and then issues the title policies. This is the same basic procedure, whether it's a $60,000 Century Village condo or a $600 million downtown Miami office building. Same concept, same, for the most part, same forms, same everything, just differences in complexity and liability. The title commitment, which we're going to go into in more detail, discloses the status of title to the property, provides the insureds the opportunity to review what they're buying, okay, whether it's the insured lender or the insured owner. We'll go into that in a second. It identifies requirements, like a checklist that must be done to get to closing, and it identifies to what's not covered under the policy. That's what the title commitment does, and it has 3 pieces to it. And we're going to go over a title commitment, a real one, well, fake real one, okay? But it's 3 pieces to it. There's Schedule A, which is basically what is, and this will make sense when you say it. Schedule B1, which is your checklist of what needs to be done before you go to closing, and Schedule B2, which are all the things that are not going to be covered by the policy. Now, please don't ask me why it's A, B1, B2 instead of A, B, C. I have no idea. I've asked a lot of very, very in the biz people, and no one seems to know. It's just A, B1, B2. No idea why. I don't think there is a C. Okay, that bothers me. The owner's policy protects the owner interest. Okay, provides protection equal to the purchase price. It's effective the day titles are transferred to the buyer and then insures back in time. It does not insure like homeowners insurance, like the casualty insurance, things that are going to happen in the future. It insures against things that happened already, that pop up later. It's good forever, as long as you own the property. Doesn't ever need to be renewed, never needs to be repaid, never needs to be, annual fees, I wish, but nothing like that. Should be filed away safely with the recorded deed, because if you go to refinance, you can get a discount on your next policy, believe it or not, in some circumstances, called reissue credit. It can be very helpful if you need to sell, and of course you need it to file a claim. Okay, there is no central repository, like, oh, I bought this property, I remember I got a title insurance policy, I'm gonna look it up in the title insurance database. There's no such thing. Okay, to be clear, you can call up your title company if they still have the records, they'll tell you. But since title companies, title attorneys may have multiple underwriters, you don't even know who to go ask. Okay, it's an insurance policy like State Farm or Allstate. You get into a wreck and you don't know that you lost all your paperwork. Who do you call? Call every insurance company, dang it. Okay, you try that. Okay, so, people want to hold on to that.
A quick question.
Yep. Go ahead.
It says that protects on the price of the purchase, right? The purchase price. What if there is improvements or other increases of values thereafter?
Okay, it's a good question. I was actually kind of waiting for someone to ask it. Then too bad, so sad. You bought a $300,000 policy, you got a $300,000 policy. So, which is, I guess it makes sense in most normal cases, but wait, I'm getting a construction loan. I'm gonna take this $50,000 vacant land and build a $500,000 house on it. So that is like doable. So basically you get a $550,000 in the scenario policy that steps up as work is done. That keeps up with it to a limit. So for construction. Okay, so like when a developer is building a building, it may not be built yet, but they'll still get a $10 million policy, for the whole building. Okay, you follow? Also, you can always go back, let's say like, you bought a house in 1963, you have a $30,000 policy for your $700,000 home. You can go get a new title insurance policy now, all you want. You go back to the title agent and say, hey, I've owned this property for 40 years. I want more coverage. They'll do a title. They'll do it just like a closing. Do all the same searching. If everything's cool, they'll give you a title policy.
Okay.
The only thing it won't cover is stuff you did. In other words, you put a little time bomb there. Nah. But outside stuff, yes. And people do that occasionally.
What if the damages are greater than the value of the property?
Alex, do that again. It broke up.
What if the damages are greater than the value of the property or your policy?
Then you're covered up to your policy limits. Same as any other type of insurance. So, if you have a $100,000 liability insurance policy, let's just say in your business and you like really screw up and someone gets $1 million of damages, your insurance companies go, yeah, you're screwed. Here's $100,000. I'm out. And that's the end of it. That's like every insurance company can do that. Title insurance company, if it's a $300,000 policy and it's going to cost $400,000 to fix the problem, they hand you a check and say, here's your $300,000 that you paid when you bought the property. Sorry about the lost depreciation. Have a good life. Go sue them.
What if, let's just say there's a hidden lien on the property that's maybe not found. I don't know if this is a reality, but it's not found during the title search.
Mm-hmm.
And that exceeds damages, exceed again the value of the policy. Is the owner stuck with it still?
Well, here's the real world, right? These are great questions, especially for this class, because it's a property development class. So here you have an insurance company. This insurance company is going to have a claims manager who's going to hire inside or outside lawyers. Okay, they're going to look at the economics of the policy. They're going to look at what's covered, and they're going to look at the problem. If the problem can be fixed, whether by attorneys or by writing a check for less money than the policy limits, and that way the insurance company doesn't have to pay out the entire policy, that's what they will do. If it's going to be more or significantly more, they're just going to what's called tender their policy. This applies to any insurance company, not just title insurance. They're going to tender their policy and say, have a nice life. I mean, a perfect example, I was brought in on a case by a negligence attorney, a personal injury attorney. And part of this case, a pretty big part of it, involved it was professional liability in this case, involved a property and title insurance. Okay, but we didn't end up yet having to hit the title insurance, but the attorney who was getting sued, who screwed up, had a malpractice insurance policy, I think of $250,000. The problem that attorney created was in excess of $250,000. Not much, actually. It's like a $300,000 problem. Okay, but it was a slam dunk. Like anyone who knew could look at it and point to it, which is why they actually brought me in as an expert on real estate law. Could like, here's where he messed up. Here's where he messed up again. Here's where he should have caught it. Here's where he didn't, like it was that easy. Boom, 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 connect the dots. The insurance company, we got them, literally they made a demand letter, the attorney, got on the phone for 20 minutes, talked about it with the adjuster and their attorney. And a week later, we got a check for the entire policy. They knew they were gonna lose, wasn't worth the extra costs beyond the 250. Here's our 250, we're out. Now, in this case, they actually, like it was close enough to the dollar amount. We waived some of the liability and it worked out good, but it was just better for them to tender. So that's what the insurance company is going to do. So if you have a $300,000 policy and it's a $400,000 claim on a title insurance, you're going to get 300 grand. The owner's going to get 300 grand. And that's it. But realistically, if you just bought the property 6 months ago for 300 grand, yeah, it sucks. You had to move, all that stuff. But that's why it's better than not having insurance. Then you'd have nothing. Not $300,000. So it's an insurance policy. And it's not your only thing. Like, look, if the closing agent screwed up, you're probably gonna end up paying, suing this closing agent. If the seller, knew about the lien but failed, you may probably gonna sue the seller. So you still have those other remedies. But this insurance policy is good. So the same applies too for the lender, right? So the lender gets, which we were just talking about, a loan policy or a mortgagee policy, right? And what that means is that they're covered up to the amount of their loan. So if there's a title issue, like this $400,000 lien pops up, the lender is going to make a claim. Okay, now we're looking at two policies. We're looking at a $250,000 loan policy and a $300,000 owner's policy. In this case, that's, I'm not good at math, $550,000 of coverage, $400,000 lien. It's going to get paid off, the lien, because it's better for the insurer. Okay, now title insurance is an insurance product, meaning that you're not required to buy it to get a property. It's completely optional. Okay, a lot of people will say, well, if my lender is getting a policy, what do I need? To pay for that extra owner's policy. But that example that we just brought up is a perfect example of why you both need one. Now, I've never met a lender that wouldn't insist as a condition of the loan, a title insurance policy in its favor. Any owner who does is a fool. Again, because what happened, you have this $400,000 lien, there's no owner's policy, only the lender's policy. The title insurance company writes a $250,000 check to the lender, the loan gets paid off, but the homeowner who paid that extra 50 plus moved in is still out of the house. Or building owner if it's a giant, office building. Right? So that comes into play there. But it's an insurance product. Now the good news is, and we'll go over it in a second. Oh, I'll go over it in a second. Okay, so does that answer your question? And that's the real world insurance. I mean, this is stuff you guys go into development or investments that you will deal with this at some point. It's old business. Like the insurance company's gonna do what's in their best interest, and they'll try to help. But if it's cheaper to write a check, they'll write a check. If it's cheaper to hire an attorney, you're not getting a check. You're getting an attorney. Okay. So the lender's policy only insures the mortgage. And every time the owner refinances, there's a new loan policy that's going to be required, but not a new owner's policy because they still own the property. Plus they can use, if they still have it, their existing owner's policy to get a discount. So remember that, save you some money. Okay. Now, like I said, there's no lender on the planet that I've ever heard of that doesn't insist on title insurance. I've met some owners who tried saying, I don't need it. They're wrong, but I guess that's their right. Okay, so we talked about what title insurance covers, but it also doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover the buyer's mortgage, property taxes owned by the buyer, valid utility easements, violation by the buyer of restrictive covenants. We'll go over that later. But basically, they're breaking the rules in the community. Defects known by the buyer, like you can't try to put one over on the insurance company. Zoning issues or new matters that first occur after the policy goes into effect. Title insurance is, well, I wrote it's complicated, but it's actually not. It's pretty straightforward. Up to $1 million. It's $5.75 per thousand for the first 100,000. It's not going to be the test. $5 per thousand up to $1 million. So it's just if you have a $100,000 property, it's $575. Okay. If you have $1 million property, it's $5,075. because it's 900 times $5 per 1,000, 900,000 times 5. So very straightforward, okay? After $1 million, it starts going down. Okay, it's set by statute. The rates are set by the legislature, and every title agent legally is supposed to charge that same rate. No more, no less. Okay? You only pay for it once. Okay? However, if you get two policies, it's kind of BOGO, buy one, get one. So there's something called simultaneous issue. So if you get an owner's policy, your lender's policy costs next to nothing. $50, $100, $25 a penny. So if you buy a house for $500,000, $400,000 mortgage, or an office building, whatever, you're going to pay full price for the $500,000 policy, but you can only pay a few pennies for the $400,000 policy for the lender. So it's pretty close to equivalent to buy one, get one free. The only one difference is that the lender's policy usually has add-ons like endorsements that can cost you a few $100. So there's absolutely never a good reason not to get both policies because they cost almost the same amount of money, but provide double coverage. Okay, does that make sense? Simultaneous? It's like buy one, get one. Okay, you also get discounts for certain things. So for example, if you bought the property very, very recently, and now you're selling it, you get a big discount. Because not a lot of time has gone by, there's really no additional risk. If your lender, you're refinancing with the same exact lender, you get a discount. If you're refinancing with a different lender and you have a copy of your original title insurance policy, you get a discount. Okay, so while we say it's $5 or $5.75 per 1,000, oftentimes it's less than that because there's ways, certain times you can discount.
For the reissue, or when you ask for the seller's ownership, it's 2 years, right? That they have.
Forever. The question was, you only have 2 years to get reissued. Now, an owner's policy is a common misconception in the field. An owner's policy provides reissue credit for future refinances forever. You can use it as many times as you want. If you buy a house, you get an owner's title insurance policy. Anytime you refinance thereafter, you can use that to get a discount on your refinance.
What if it's not a refinance and you're selling?
No, that's something different.
That's 2 years.
That's the two. It's 1 to 3, depending on different discount rates. Correct. Now, the good news, this is all set out in statutes and administrative rules. The better news is, all you got to do is ask the title attorney and they'll tell you. We've all pretty much memorized it. Okay, all you have to know is that this stuff exists. You know, you got to ask, hey, can I get reissue rate? You don't got to know how much it is. No, it's less. The rest of it's just calculations. Okay, any questions on that? That's why, I mean, like, you don't need to know the rates for the test. You just need to have a general idea. It's about $500 per 100,000, give or take, for the first $1 million. You know, just to have an idea for development purposes, investment purposes, what it's going to cost you. Now, if I did this right, we are going to look at an actual, mostly real title insurance policy commitment, not a policy, but commitment. And it did not work. So bear with me a second. Why did not that work? I actually spent more time trying to make this part of it work than the rest of the slideshow, and it still doesn't work. Give me 1 second. I have a backup plan.
$500 for the 500,000 or for the million?
No, it's $5.75 per 1,000 for the first $100,000. Then it goes to $5 per 1,000 to $1 million, and then it goes down from there in increments. So let's say you have a $300,000 property, you'd have $200,000 at $5 per 1,000. So 200 times, that's $1,000. It's really times 0.005, right? And then you have, for the first 100,000, you have 575. Your title policy for 300,000 is 1575. The good news is there's calculators all over the internet, and like most, you know, there's books like Title Company, just call them. So you really don't need to memorize it, but it's a good idea to have a rough idea. Okay, it's typically about $500 per 100,000 for the insurance itself. For the first policy, the second policy is almost BOGO. I don't get one. Can everyone see the title commitment? Yep. On the,
Yes.
okay, good.
Yes.
Excellent. Let me see if I can make it a little bigger.
Right below the green box.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so there's an organization called ALTA, American Land Title Association. ALTA is the national, kind of the right word for it. It's not part of the government, but you have to use their forms by law. Okay, and it has different slight variations for each state. And you got to give them money to use their forms. So, you know, ALTA isn't a government agency per se, but if you want to do title insurance, you got to pay them for their forms. And which is good and bad. First of all, it's very inexpensive, a couple $100 a year for a license, for as many as you want. And more importantly, it's standard language that's been agreed upon by all the lenders out there are already cool with the approved language. So it's good to have a standard product. Okay, so they're all going to say American Land Title Association. All your policies are going to have those words, everyone. It's the form, not the insurance company. The insurance company, in this case, let's say it's Old Republic National Title Insurance Company. Okay, there's a couple dozen of them. There's like 5 big ones. Old Republic's one of them, Fidelity, Stewart. Okay, there's others. First American. They're insurance companies. It's like State Farm or Allstate or Geico. Okay, they're giant insurance companies. Okay, a title insurance commitment is basically a contract from this insurance company through its agent, just like you have a State Farm agent. I'm an agent, my company is, Gibraltar, and I'm personally an agent for Old Republic National Title. Okay, so through your agent, you will get a contract called a commitment saying that per everything in here and all these rules, if you do what I say and give me money, I will give you title insurance. That's all a title commitment is. Okay, and a title commitment always, just like a title policy, consists of 2 parts. The jacket, which is all the pre-printed stuff that never changes, and then the schedules, which is all of the stuff that does change. And this is pretty much the same for any insurance policy, by the way. Okay, everyone uses promulgated forms, like even your auto insurance, it's all state approved, privately written, state approved. And the only thing that changes are the variables, not the actual terms. Okay, so basically this says, this commitment's not an abstract or a report, it's just what we'll give a policy if you do what we say. We don't have any liability if you try to use this as an abstract. Okay, we will issue policy as long as you do everything we say and give us money. Okay, and we will do it under these conditions. We can amend it. You don't got to memorize this stuff, you know, but it's just that sort of thing. You do all this stuff and do it our way, we'll give you insurance at the end of the closing. Okay, and then you go on to your schedules. Now, if you're in a transaction and they don't send you the jacket, which happens a lot, which is the part I just showed you, don't worry about it. It's literally the same for everyone. Okay, it never changes. They don't know that. Let me say it never changes. There's different versions. Like, for example, this is the 2016 version with Florida modifications. You will almost never see any other versions, and lenders in their title closing instructions tell you what version they want to use. So if there's really only 2 out there, 91 and 16, everyone's saying 16 now. Okay, before there was 16, it was always 91. So just be aware, it's not, you don't really got to worry about it, but understand that there are slight differences in coverage between what year it is. Okay, so, you know, you want the most recent one, but it's always going to be, if there's a lender involved, it's always going to be the most recent one, and otherwise. Okay, again, I can't stress enough that this is an insurance product, although it's part of every transaction. So again, this is your schedule. So you have Schedule A, like we spoke about, Schedule B1 and B2. Schedule A is what is. Now, this is a real title insurance commitment from a real transaction that we handled where I deviously changed certain details to protect the innocent and guilty, just like Law and Order. Okay, so issuing file number is not really XXXXXXX, nor is that our Alta ID. Okay, just to give you the idea. And MSRED, Master of Science Real Estate Development title, is not a real company. Okay, nor is this a real address. But everything else on here is real. Okay, and this is what they all look like. In this, the fonts may change, but what's in them does not. Okay, it tells you the important stuff again. You gotta things you need to check as the developer, the realtor, even the investor, whatever it is, are the details of a title commitment. Okay, and I'm going to tell you, if you're investing in a property, working with a developer, whatever, and this is part of your role, you best be reading the title commitments. It's part of your job. Okay, and it's important. Okay, so fortunately, they're easy to read. Okay, I keep saying okay. The first part is commitment date. That just tells you what date this information is good for. If it gets too long in the tooth, let's say more than 30 days, get it updated. The title company should do it anyway. The title company should do it anyway. Then it tells you what policies they're going to issue. And as you can see on this one, they're going to issue an Alta owner's policy. Okay, the 06 version, which is fine. Okay, in this amount, 667 and change. Okay, that's in paragraph 2. It's telling you who they're issuing it to, who's going to be the insured owner after the closing. Purchasing Company LLC, a DC LLC. Okay, and if you notice, the mortgagee policy, the loan policy is blank because this is a cash deal. Okay, under this commitment, they're not issuing a $700,000 policy. They're issuing a 600. So you need to get this amended if the purchase price changes. Then, I've got a chat. Can anyone not see the screen? Here, I can blow it up more. Is
See the screen, but we can.
that better?
Nothing changed. It just shows the Alta.
Oh, you don't, oh. So you don't see this screen? Okay, I'm so sorry then. Hold on a second. I'm glad someone said something. Ah, I see. We could see it in class. You guys couldn't see it. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Good.
Yeah.
Let me back up a little. The first part of what I was talking about started with that same piece here. You're all seeing it move now, right? Someone
Yes.
just nodded their head. Okay, good. Okay, and then we talked about the whole Alta thing. We talked about the conditions and the jacket, and all this is the jacket. It's 3 pages. That never changes. Okay, and then we started talking about the actual schedule, starting with Schedule A. And so the office file, all those X's I was talking about, the MS-RED title over here, where it says an issuing agent, those are all details. You look at the property address, make sure it's for the right property. The commitment date we spoke about a minute ago here on paragraph 1, and then the policies to be issued in paragraph 2. That should catch everyone up. Everyone seeing that now?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, it was, we could see it on our projector. I just thought it was going through, but I guess not. Okay, so good. We're good. All right. So now here's like kind of cool, right? Going to bring it back around to a little while ago. The estate or interest in the land described is fee simple. So we're talking about fee simple, like right back to the beginning of the class. We're not talking about a lease. We're not talking about a life estate. We're not talking about anything else but fee simple. Title is going to pass. Right now, title is vested currently in Seller Limited and Nevada Corporation. Okay, and then down in paragraph 5, you see where it says the legal description. Now notice we're not using a property address for how you describe the land. We talked about that last class. Okay, the legal description, unit number, Brickell condominium, official records book and page. And that's so we can specifically, clearly identify the legal boundaries of the property. And then you would want this signed with an actual wet signature. Okay, as far as I know, they can't be e-signed still, but I'm sure people do. Okay, this is a legally binding contract, just so you understand. And then we go to Schedule B1. B1 is the requirements. I like to call it the checklist. What this means is that everything on this list must be completed or waived in order to get that title insurance policy or policies after closing. These are all the things that need to be done to get through closing. Okay, so if anything really changes, you got to tell the title insurance company. Pretty obvious. Pay the agreed amount. So you got to pay for the policy, for the property before you get the policy. You got to pay for the policy. That's number 3. You got to do the correct documents to convey title or create the mortgage to be insured. And here's a little bonus question. Can someone tell me the difference between selling a property and conveying a property? Bonus points.
Selling, you have fee simple rights, and conveying, you only have the deed.
That's an excellent guess. Anyone else? That's true. Conveyance doesn't necessarily involve money. That's correct. So I will not keep you all in suspense. Everyone messes up, including a lot of attorneys. When you sell a property, you get someone to sign a contract to buy it. It's the marketing act, the sale. Conveying a property is actually transferring title to the property. They don't necessarily go hand in hand. And that's why you usually see sell and convey, because you're both selling it, contracting to convey it, and actually conveying it. Okay, and it's very important because, like, if you do a power of attorney, let's say, and you give your agent, we'll talk about power of attorney later, but for those who've heard of them, your agent the right to sell your property, they can enter a contract, but they can't sign the deed because a deed conveys property, a contract sells it. Okay, so in this case, you notice it's saying conveys the property, not sells it. Okay, the warranty deed, written consent to the board of directors of the condominium, written consent to the board of directors of the master condominium, all that needs to be obtained and recorded. Proof of payment of the 2020 taxes, proof that in the form of a written statement that the condominium has enough money to pay for the elevator repairs that are currently in progress, because there's what's called a notice of commencement filed. An exception for the notice of commencement will be deleted if the following conditions are met. Boom, 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 boom. We're not going to go through, these are so different. There's literally a book where all these come from called the Standard Commitment Clause Library. So depending on what needs to be done, you pull out the standard language and you insert it with the details. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea what you're looking at. Obtain a statement in the closing affidavit from the title holder that there's no terms of default, no default in the terms of the assignment and pledge at this booking page. Satisfactory evidence that Seller Limited, a Nevada company, is duly organized and in good standing. Compliance with the laws of that state to make sure they can buy, sell, and convey property. Satisfactory evidence that the property being sold is in the usual course of business of that company as defined in this Florida statute. There's a lot of work here, just as the point. Certified copy of the corporate charter or articles of incorporation. In this case, this one really was an out-of-country company, not a Nevada company. I just simplified it. And that's where that comes into play. Record a corporate resolution saying who can sign for the company, that they're not in bankruptcy, etc. Certificate of incumbency, blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on. Homeowners estoppel, etc., etc. Okay, so this was a complicated deal we did, which is why I chose this one. And when you're doing commercial, this isn't even, there are a lot more detailed than this. This is just a condo. Okay, and it goes on, closing funds must be dispersed by the title agent. an owner's affidavit, an update, da, 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 da. Okay, and those are all the things you have to do to get to closing. So when you're wondering what your title insurance policy costs as much as it costs, this is part of the reason why. All these things must be done to transfer marketable title. If all these things are not done, then the title's not marketable. Okay, make sense? Any questions on requirements? I don't expect you to know any, like in detail. I just want you to know what they are. Then you have Schedule B2, and again, I have no idea why it's not Schedule C, and that is your exceptions. Okay, now in this list, these are all the things that the title insurance will not cover. First and foremost, it doesn't cover, it does not recreate any exceptions to coverage for discriminatory purposes. Okay, there are a lot of older land-based restrictions that restrict ownership based on race, gender, sexual orientation, religion. You know, there's literally restrictions like no Jews allowed in this community. You're not allowed to sell to Jewish people. That exists in the land records. They're not valid anymore. They're still saying that though. The law just said everything that said all these bad things, it's an old civil rights law, is no longer valid, but it didn't make like someone go in there with a magic marker and fix all the public records. So what this is saying, all that nonsense is nonsense. Okay, very important. I know it's kind of like weird nowadays, 2020, but that stuff used to exist in the 50s when some of these communities were made before. It doesn't cover defects, liens first appearing after the commitment, because how is that possible? You know, it's not Back to the Future. It doesn't cover new taxes, rights, claims, blah, blah, blah. All these things are stuff it won't cover. Okay. Now, as an investor developer, you need to understand that this part, the exceptions, is somewhat negotiable. Okay, very important. I mean, I'm slowing down to say, when you're an investor or you're working for a developer and you get this list, you don't go, oh, okay. It has to be reviewed, typically by your attorney, and say, yeah, no, we're not taking this one. We need to get rid of this one. We need to get rid of this one. Some of them can be gotten rid of by doing additional requirements. Some of them are not negotiable. Okay, very, very important. So you will, like, if you're buying a house, you know, with your mom or whatever, or yourself, you're not negotiating your exceptions. If you're buying for a developer or an investment, you are going to be negotiating. The only ones on a residential you're going to negotiate are what's called standard exceptions, which are the first few. Okay, and those you can get rid of those, for example, by getting a survey. Okay, you can get rid of those by, well, I'm going to use Alec as an example. He asked me about mineral rights. You know, mineral rights are typically going to be accepted under exceptions. So if it was important for you to retain or be insured for mineral rights, that would require additional requirements to do searches based on mineral rights. So I hope that answers that question. Okay. The big one that always comes up is what's called literal and riparian rights, which are water rights. Those always come up, especially on commercial deals if it's anywhere near the water. And those are the ones that are negotiable. You know, those can be insured with the right, you know, surveys, affidavits, and research being done. So just because you get a commitment that has all these things accepted doesn't mean that's the end of it. You're going to be negotiating it, and it's well beyond the scope of this class. But at the very least, you can most certainly ask for the standard exceptions to be removed at closing. And like, there's no title company that'll say no to that. But everyone asks. And usually they do it even if you don't ask. And those are the first few. Okay? Everyone understand what this list is and that it's negotiable to some extent. Like, you're not getting rid of this easement unless it really doesn't. So basically what happens is that the title examiner is going to put everything as an exception that they're unsure of. And then when the buyer makes a big deal out of it, they'll go back and look and only stand their ground if it's really a problem. Okay, so for example, we had one a couple days ago where there was a plat restrictions, like a development. Development fell apart, a new developer bought it, replatted it. Okay, and then built the community. The title underwriter put in the old plat and the new plat as exceptions. But the old plat was wiped out. It really didn't need to be there. The buyer's attorney said something about it. We took it. And you put it on because if no one complains, and it's less coverage. And it's valid. You don't put on nonsense like, oh, all the mortgages. Of course not. But this is putatively an issue. They complained. We did some additional research. Make sense? Any questions on that? And as you can see, it's a pretty cohesive list. Okay, and that is the title commitment. Questions on the title commitment? Good. The important takeaways is that you got to look at it, make sure you understand it, and it's negotiable to some extent. Okay. We had already talked about abstract title commitment, title insurance policies, MRTA, and underwriting, and that all applies here as well. Moving on, conveyances. We are leaving title insurance in the dust. Last chance for questions on title insurance in closing.
On the title side, my biggest takeaway is don't lose your phone number.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, you got to know enough about it to know what questions to ask your attorney. It's actually very true. And that's, working with developers over my career, in some cases, national developers, that was the exact amount of knowledge they needed. Like, that looks like a long list. What can we get rid of? So that's what that's the takeaway. Okay, very good. It's a good point because it's true. Okay, conveyances, don't go feudal. Don't even go feudal on you. And that's again, because I have a bad sense of humor. But again, I wanted to remind you that all this stems from 1,000 years ago, which is why some of it's weird. It's not Bitcoin. Okay, deeds. We spoke about this a little bit last week. Deeds are the tangible manifestation of the intent to transfer real property. More word salad. Okay, it means that it's a physical thing showing the people's intent. It's the intent that matters. That's the key part. We did last week the feudal law ceremony called Livery of Season, where we handed over the piece of dirt and pointed to the rock and the tree. That's where all of it comes from. All of that evolved into the modern deeds we use today. Deeds are statutory in nature. Okay, what we called again an abrogation of common law. Common law was the ceremony. Deeds were made up by law to replace the way of doing it. And therefore, since it's statutory, it must be strictly followed. Okay, and what does that mean? It means there's certain things that must be in a deed. Generally speaking, it needs to be the buyer, the seller, what's being sold, words of the quality of what's being sold, like all the promises, we'll go over that in a minute. 2 witnesses, signed by the seller, and notarized property. Okay, not sworn, but acknowledged. If all those are in place, and I don't expect you to memorize that, then you have a valid deed. If they're not, you don't have a valid deed. Okay, and those are protections because it's a tangible manifestation of intent. So it has to be done right. There's also constitutional requirements. And what this means, and let's see, do I have the next one? No, I do not. What this means in particular is that in Florida, Article 10, Section 4 of the Constitution states that if it is your primary residence, your homestead, and you're married, if the property is not in both names, both spouses still must sign the deed or sign the mortgage. It's called spousal joinder. And the key takeaway for you guys is that for mortgages and deeds, spousal joinder is necessary for primary residences. Okay, that's very, very, very important. So if I own a property and I live there, but I'm married, and I sell the property without my wife signing, I sold nothing. If I mortgage the property without my wife signing the mortgage, I did not give a valid mortgage. Okay, Very important. Only applies to married couples owned by one of the spouses, only applies to primary residences. However, it trips people up constantly. So it's important to know. And it's in our Constitution. It's obviously a protection to protect spouses from having the property literally sold, their home sold out from them, or mortgaged out from under them. There's lots of types of conveyances. There's warranty deeds, special warranty deeds, quitclaim deeds, trustee deeds, certificate of title, probate, court order, da, 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 da. To put it very simply, as long as you meet that list of requirements, the rest of it is just flavor that can obviously have big effects, but it doesn't need to be on a special form. It just needs to fit all the stuff. You know, you have to have the witnesses, the description, all that stuff has to be in there. The rest of it just refers to the situation or the character of what's being sold. We'll go into that a little more. Yeah, okay. I mean, I guess there's, we got some comments on that one. I won't comment. All right, so there's lots of ways for property to be conveyed. Okay, and we talked about the deeds. You can also get a certificate of title. That's when it's like a foreclosure sale, probate, you get it through a court order, etc. Okay. Now we're going to talk about present and future interest. Now, fortunately, we already spoke about this a little, so I don't think this is going to be too killer for you at this point, at least in concept. As you may remember from so long ago, Max, go ahead before I get started.
On the previous slide, quitclaim deed, most of the days when I'm on Papa, it's just quitclaim deeds or the residential.
We will, I'm going to go over the differences between the first three in a bit, but here's what I'll say now, and important for you guys as future real estate developers. Whether it's a warranty deed, a special warranty deed, or a quitclaim deed, refers to the covenants or warranties that are being given with the conveyance. In other words, the claims and promises that the seller is making to the buyer, or the grantor is making to the grantee, to be more technically correct. In a warranty deed, the grantor is saying, I own this property, I will defend it forever. You can count on it. Take it to the bank. Okay, in a special warranty deed, they're limiting that, saying, I own this property, and if anything happened while I was the owner, I will protect you on that forever. But stuff before I owned it, it's not my fault. And on a quitclaim deed, you're saying, here you go, see ya. So if you're a grantee, a buyer, you do not want a quitclaim deed, period, because it gives you no promises. And as you'll see in a little bit, some of these promises are very important. If you have to take a special warranty deed, which is typically the only type a developer is going to give, you can live with it, make sure you have title insurance. If what you really want is a warranty deed or a full warranty deed, because it has all the promises, all the protections, it's the most protected. Quitclaim deed should only be used for a few certain purposes. And really what a quitclaim deed is saying is not so much, here's a new property for you, but it's saying, look, you can have what I got, I'm out. And there's a big difference for that. So if there's a cloud on title, a problem on title, if you inherited a property and you don't want to deal with it at all, because you didn't really own it for more than 10 minutes, and you want to give it to your siblings, quitclaim deed. If you're single and you get married, a lot of people will use quitclaim deeds for that to add their spouse. So it's not a good practice, but it's very common. You should use a special warranty deed for a zillion reasons. If you get divorced, like wait, who made those chat comments? All right, if you get divorced, family law attorneys seem to think you should use quitclaim deeds. They're wrong always. You should definitely never ever use a quitclaim deed. If you get divorced to take a property from your spouse, you should at least get a special warranty deed for, again, a myriad of reasons that would be on this class. But what you're going to get is a quitclaim deed because family lawyers are impossible to deal with. Okay, lesson, don't get divorced. Okay, so there's difference. And so Max, you will see a ton of quitclaim deeds. That's just because people are using the wrong tool or not the best tool. But when you buy a property for consideration, usually you'll see a warranty deed or a special warranty deed. And most of the time, that's the right way to go.
If there's a quick claim deed, on the property, can you just switch it over to a special warranty deed?
Well, if everyone agrees to, you can. But again, quitclaim deeds are usually used to clean things up, like to clean up title, not to truly convey title. You know, so let's say that, you know, for example, someone in the chain of title, there was like a deed with a bad legal description that included a couple of feet of the side of your property. You go to your neighbor and like, hey, look, there's an issue with this 10-foot strip on the side of that where our properties meet. And like, yeah, I know, I'll fix it. They're not going to give you a warranty deed for that 10 feet. They're going to give you a quitclaim. And that's perfectly okay. Typically with like probate matters and whatnot, you're going to want to, George, that's quite funny. You're going to want to, use quitclaim deeds, and most of the time, though, a personal representative's deed, which doesn't say warranty deed on it, actually is a special warranty. And that leads me to the next point, which is a really good point. The title of the deed does not matter. If you have a quitclaim deed that says quitclaim deed on the top, or frankly, it says quick claim deed, Q-U-I-C-K, because apparently half the world thinks that's how you spell it, which is true. Like I can't imagine, you can't even understand how many times people put quick claim deeds, which is not right. If you have it says quick claim deed on the top, but it contains the warranties in the text, it's a warranty deed. And if it says warranty deed on top, and it doesn't contain the covenants, and we'll talk about those in a second, it's a quitclaim deed. Just so you understand, it's not the title. You'll oftentimes also see something called the statutory warranty deed in contracts, and that is just a warranty deed in a certain format. Because again, like I said, as long as the stuff's there, it doesn't matter what order or how you do it. They just all got to be there. So there's different forms, some prettier than others. But what's in them is what matters. Kind of like pies. Lots of different formats, but it's what's in them that matters. All right. Now, present and future interest deals with ownership. We talked about property ownership is measured by power and time. You remember that pretty graphic I created? It has the 0 to 100 and now to infinity. Okay, power refers to your power to exercise control over the property. Time refers to how long that power lasts. The strongest part is fee simple, like we spoke about 100% of power for all time. Okay, it's important to understand that. Now, we talked about some basic rules of transferring property before. Rule number 1, which you've heard me say many times today, you can only transfer what you got. You can't transfer more than you have. That's rule number 1. Okay, with that, you don't have to transfer everything. You can reserve interests for yourself. That would be a restriction or a reservation. You can also transfer a lesser interest, an easement. So for example, you can say, I still own this property, but you can walk over that path. You can cut through, I'm going to sell you the right to cut through my yard to get to the lake just to go fishing. And that's an interest you can transfer. So at this 100% power, quote unquote, you can transfer only a small portion of that power or only a small piece of that power for specific reasons. I am transferring to Lucy, you know, the right to use my garage on Wednesdays. That is actually something you could do. Okay, and that's perfectly fine. But once you do transfer it, unless you reserved interest for yourself, like the right to have backsies, you know, to take it back, you don't. Lucy now owns it and can sell it, but no more than what Lucy has. You can also transfer interest subject to a later event. And the easiest example is a life estate. Life tenant gets it until they die, and then someone else gets it. And you can set all that up in advance. And you can, you know, it's to Lucy for life, then to Mary, then to Gina, then to Gary. You can do that. There's a limit. Called the rule against perpetuities. You should ever hear the term, but since like 1% of lawyers understand it, I'm not going to subject you to it. Everyone understand that? There's two other rules that, or at least one other I want to mention because it's very important. And that the first rule is you can only transfer what you have. And the second really important rule, I think I'll skip the third one, is that there can be no gap in season, or there can be no gap in ownership. And what that means is that every property is always owned by somebody. There's never a second where any piece of sand is not owned by somebody. There's not a minute, there's not a second, there's not a microsecond. Every piece of real estate is always owned by somebody. That somebody may be the government, but it's always owned by somebody, and it's always owned by somebody for every minute, for every piece. So there can't be time gaps where no one owns it, and there can't be land gaps. Like that strip of land, no one owns it. Someone owns it. You might not know who it is, but someone owns it. And I'll tell you, real life, I know you guys like real life. I was doing a deal in Key West, a couple of years ago now. And Key West is old. And when Key West was mapped out, they used less sophisticated equipment to do the mapping. So as technology got better, in between this lot, lot 1 and lot 2, it turns out that because of the technology, there's strips of land that weren't transferred. So someone went like, in 1823 or whatever, forget it, the date, but 1868. And they created lot 1, lot 2, lot 3, using the surveying tools at the time. They created mapped descriptions of these lots. And then for the next 100 years, they transferred lot 1, lot 2, lot 3, shorthand. Now it turns out, as we have better technology, that 203.6 feet to the west is actually 204.8 feet. So in Key West, and it's because it's one of the oldest parts of Florida, and it's also St. Augustine, there's whole little strips of land on the borders that, quote unquote, nobody owns. So when you transfer lot 1, lot 2, lot 3, there may be a 1-inch strip of land going through the middle of your new building that's not part of any. Very important though, someone owns that. It's probably the person who owned it in 1867 still, and their heirs. And you can imagine that's a giant pain in the neck. Okay, so when I say everybody always owns land, someone always owns it, somebody always owns it. And in this case, we had to go back and find some of those people. Fortunately, most of it turned out to be the state of Florida. But we had to look at 100-year-old land patents and stuff to figure out who owned that 1 inch that was going to go through the lobby of the new hotel. Big job. So very important. And the third rule I will share briefly is that all land should be used. And what that means is that land shouldn't sit dormant if it should be used for a purpose. And it's a little beyond the scope of the class, but it actually matters in that, if you're choosing, we'll talk about this in a minute, between someone who's letting land go to waste, to go fallow, and someone else who's working it, the person who's actually doing something with it, rights, may actually become the owner because they're doing something with it. And those are the 3 basic rules of real estate that go back 1,000 years. Some examples concerning future interest and some of these limitations on interest are life estates and ladybird deeds. I'm not going to continue beating that horse. Life estates based on a life of another. Reversionary deeds. Okay, what this means is I say, okay, you can have this land as long as you keep a church on it, an active church. As soon as you stop using it as a church, I get it back, or my heirs. That's very common, by the way. The church goes on for 90 years, the church goes out of business or whatever, the property goes back to the original grantor's heirs. That's a very common thing, okay? Church law, actually church development is a whole specialized area of law and development, which is, by the way, very profitable for developers and lenders. Contracts and leases. Contracts and leases, as we talked about, are smaller forms of ownership. As we talked about a little bit last week, when we talked about beneficial legal interest, even contracts transfer some ownership rights. Cooperative apartments, which are similar to condos, we'll talk about those later. And sometimes it's very complicated. Like they really can reach out and do some crazy things. We had some examples today. We had a few, let me just see something real quick. Bear with me 1/2 second, guys. Okay, we're moving properly on time. Okay, some other documents you may see is power of attorney. A power of attorney form, okay, and this is like a little note-taking piece, is where a principal gives certain legal power and authority to an agent. There's two, people call it the power of attorney, but it's not, it's an agent. There's two pieces to this, okay, the principal and the agent. So if you own a property and you can't be there for closing, you'll create a power of attorney form giving someone else the authority to sign and convey the deed. Now, these power of attorney forms, and what's important to you all as real estate development class people, is that the document that's going to be executed by the agent and the power of attorney must have at least equal formalities. Meaning, if you're doing a power of attorney to execute a deed, it must have 2 witnesses, be notarized, a legal description, et cetera, just like the deed it's going to be used for, with certain small exceptions. Okay, power of attorneys can be limited, meaning I'm giving you a power of attorney just to do these things, or they can be unlimited, which is called durable. Why it just doesn't say unlimited, I don't know, but they're called durable. And that means I'm giving a general power of attorney to do everything, pretty much everything. When you deal with an agent, as long as you saw what looks like a real copy of the power of attorney, and you have no reason to think that it's not otherwise invalid, the principal, the person who gave the power of attorney, is bound legally by what the agent does. So be very careful giving a power of attorney. Third parties can count on it. A bill of sale is nothing but a deed for personal property, non-real property. And less formalities are necessary. You don't need witnesses, you don't need. Any questions on that? Awesome. Now we talked about the promises. The promises in or the warranties of a warranty deed are what's called covenants of title. There are 6 of them. They matter. For example, a few months ago, I sued some sellers on behalf of a buyer for breaking 3 of the 6. Each one was an individual cause of action for the lawsuit. They're actionable, true promises that can be enforced. The first promise is the first covenant, I should say, is season. You guys hear me say livery of season, season this. All it means is that ownership. It's just an old-fashioned way of saying title. You're seized of the property, if you will. Okay, the covenant of season just says that the grantor is the rightful owner of the property. Like, I really own it, you can count on it. No encumbrances, the covenant of no encumbrances, is that the land is mostly free and clear of liens and encumbrances. Okay, does anyone know the difference between a lien and an encumbrance? It's like 7 letters. They're technically, they are a little different. Typically, encumbrances are, for the most part, voluntary, whereas liens are involuntary, but that's not always the case. I mean, they're technically different beasts, but for all intents and purposes, they have the same outcome. Covenant of the right to convey. The grantor is allowed to sell the property. So we know that you can be an owner of a property, because we talked about this earlier, You can be the owner of a property and not have the right to convey it. Right? Perfect example, a renter. You own a property under a term, a tenant for years, a lease. You don't have the right to sell the property. Another example is you can deed someone a property and not give them the right to convey it for a period of time. And those of you who survived the boom bust might remember that with short sales, the lenders were putting on restrictions that you had to put on the deed, saying that the buyer could not resell the property for 1 year to stop flipping. And those are